When I was a kid, I was scared of Candyman. He was the killer from this old horror movie from 1992 that became a cult classic. Candyman had a hook for a hand, and he gut you with it for no other reason than that you said his name 5 times into a bathroom mirror.
Candyman. Candyman? Candyman.
And there was something about Candyman that seemed more real, like more dangerous than any other movie villain. I mean, there were no white guys that looked like the slasher from the Halloween franchise walking around my Southside Chicago neighborhood. Like, I didn't see a lot of dudes with hockey masks either, so those weren't as scary to me. But Candyman, he looked like somebody I might actually bump into. His brother was 6'5", with this eerie, baritone, deep voice.
What's blood for, if not for shedding?
And he wore this creepy black trench coat. And one of my big cousins knew I was scared of him, so he used to try to lock me in the bathroom with the lights off to prank me. So needless to say, I avoided watching this movie for years, even though it's set in my hometown. But not too long ago, I finally sat down to watch it. And when I did, I realized Candyman is about so much more than a murderous urban legend. See, this movie is actually about a dark chapter in the history of Chicago. It low-key shows us what happens when a city refuses to care for its own residents. And it's about who gets to feel safe in their own homes in this country, even today. Candyman is set in a public housing project called Cabrini Green. There's this graduate student named Helen who is studying urban legends, and she's dead set on finding out more about this one. In one of the early scenes, Helen is in an empty classroom at her university listening to a tape recording. Someone's describing one of the Candyman's murders. A janitor who's cleaning the room overhears the recording. In true Hollywood fashion, the janitor just so happens to know someone who can tell Helen more about Candyman.
I think her name was Ruthie Jean, and she heard this banging and smashing like somebody was trying to make a hole in the wall. So Ruthie called 911, and she said there's somebody coming through the walls, and they didn't believe her.
They thought the lady was crazy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Helen does some research and found out that a woman was killed by someone who came in through her bathroom mirror. So she and another grad student visit the high-rise apartment in the projects. They go upstairs to the murder victim's apartment. It's unlocked. They both walk in and go into Ruthie Jean's bathroom. It's eerie. After all, whoever killed her got into the apartment this same way. Helen opens the medicine cabinet.
Killer, or killers, they don't know which, smashed their way through the back of this cabinet. See, there's no wall there.
The story of Candyman is fictional, of course. We all know that saying Candyman 5 times in the bathroom mirror doesn't actually conjure up a killer ghost. But the murder of Ruthie Jean in the movie shares horrifying similarities to the killing of a real person. That woman's name wasn't Ruthie Jean, but Ruthie Mae McCoy.
It must have been a couple of years after Candyman came out. Somehow, I hadn't heard of it. And people told me, hey, you know, there's stuff in here that seems to be from the story you wrote.
That's Steve Bagheera. He's a reporter who followed the case of the real murder for years.
In the movie, they showed a Chicago Dispatch headline, "What Killed Ruthie Jean? Life in the Projects," which was almost identical to the headline of the story I wrote.
Steve wrote a series of investigative pieces about Ruthie Mae McCoy's murder for a weekly newspaper called The Chicago Reader. In 1987, after she died, he visited Ruthie Mae's apartment. It was on the 11th floor of a high-rise in one of Chicago's housing projects.
There happened to be a janitor who was cleaning up in her apartment. The door was open, and I was able to go in.
Whoever murdered Ruthie Mae McCoy somehow entered her apartment through her bathroom mirror.
She had heard the intruders coming and had called 911.
In this podcast, we're taking another look at the true nightmare that inspired a major film franchise.
They just cast her out like she was nobody. They didn't care. It was just like another black person just got murdered. Oh, okay, we'll go to the next one.
Now, when we talk about crime, we talk about violence, there's this thing where we do a presumption that the people and not the conditions are responsible.
But what if the conditions in the projects and Ruthie Mae's killers are both responsible? You're supposed to feel safe at home. But back then, and even now, that's not always the case. And sometimes the danger in our own homes comes from the very people who are supposed to protect us. Why didn't 911 get her the help she needed? And how had Ruthie Mae's medicine cabinet become a point of entry? I'm Dometi Pongo. From 48 Hours, this is Candyman, the true story behind the bathroom mirror murder. Episode 1, Left High and Dry. On April 22nd, 1987, Ruthie Mae McCoy called 911. It was 8:45 at night. Ruthie Mae was a 52-year-old grandmother who lived alone when she called police to report an attempted break-in. We're told the original recording no longer exists, but we do have a transcript, so we've asked actors to read it.
I'm alone, and I live at 1440 West 13th Street, and some people living next door have pulled their cabinets out.
What are they doing, ma'am?
They want to break in on this side where I live at.
Ruthie Mae tried to explain.
They want to break in?
Yeah, they throw the cabinets down.
They threw a cabinet down? Where?
I'm in a project. They come on the other side, but you can reach my bathroom, and they want to come through the bathroom.
Now, it's unclear if the dispatcher got this part of what Ruthie Mae was saying. She's telling them that the intruders were coming in through the bathroom.
1440 West 13th Street, apartment 1109. Okay, the elevator working.
1109?
Uh-huh.
All right, what's your name, ma'am?
Ruth McCoy.
All right, I'll send you the police.
Okay.
The dispatcher assigned a patrol car, but classified the call as a disturbance with a neighbor, not a robbery. That crucial difference likely impacted what happened next.
Ruthie Mae, when she's making the 911 call, she sounded very scared.
Back in 1987, Steve Bagheera had listened to Ruthie Mae's actual call for help.
But together enough to report to the police that she's in the projects, the elevators are working. So, it kind of underscores the fact that the elevators often aren't working. Police may not come if the elevators aren't working.
Steve was 33 when Ruthie Mae was killed. At that time, he focused his reporting on telling the stories of low-income black residents who lived on Chicago's south and west sides. He'd covered plenty of stories in the projects, but for Ruthie Mae, he wrote 2 long stories, 22,000 words in total for the Chicago Reader.
I tried to not just write about murder, but about other aspects of people's lives.
The night Ruthie Mae called 911, dispatchers also talked to 2 of her neighbors. One after the other had called to report gunshots. So 3 calls for help were made.
When police came, they got there in about 20 minutes and were there about a half hour. They knocked on her door and called out to her, got no answer. They tried to open the door. It wouldn't open. It was locked. They asked for a key to the apartment. They secured the key that was supposed to be to the apartment. It didn't work.
Officers wrote in the police report that the door was locked and that there didn't appear to be any signs of a break-in. Despite the 2 neighbors calling and Ruthie Mae herself, the officers made a controversial decision to not break the door down.
So after about a half hour, they just left.
It took another neighbor's call the next day to get someone to take action.
The next evening, they got a call. Police got a call from 11th floor neighbor named Deborah Lasley.
Yeah, I'm the one that got them to open the door.
Deborah Lasley lived down the hall from Ruthie Mae. We recently caught up with Deborah on the phone. You'll hear the connection was a little rough, and at times you can hear children in the background. But this was the only time she was available, and she knew Ruthie Mae well. We had to talk to her. Deborah lived in apartment 1101, and Ruthie Mae was in 1109. They looked out for one another.
She was my best friend in the building because I had never lived in the project neither, and me and her could get the hang of it together.
When they met, they were both new to the 11th floor of the Grace Abbott Homes, which is a part of a public housing complex. Deborah, in her 30s, was a mother of 7, and her living situation was cramped, but she made do as best she could. Ruthie Mae helped her manage and would keep an eye on her kids sometimes.
We both took care of each other every day. All during the day, she watched my kids, and we stand in the hallway and talk.
Ruthie Mae had 1 daughter and 2 grandchildren. She never married and lived on her own in Abbott Homes. Her daughter, Vernita, was in her mid-20s by then. According to her autopsy, Ruthie Mae stood 5'9" and weighed a little over 250 pounds. She had black hair mixed with a little gray. Deborah said Ruthie Mae was sweet, but that she was also the kind of woman who wasn't scared to keep the kids in the building in line.
So she was like a grandmother to my kids. And my kids, they know the respect her. So she tells them to get in the house, that means get in the house.
The night Ruthie Mae called 911, Deborah heard gunshots, but didn't think anything of them.
Yeah, we heard it, but over there, you heard shots all the time.
There was a lot of territoriality, so gangs fighting over turf. That led to more violence, that led to more guns. And that was the situation in the Abbott Homes at the time Ruthie Mae was killed.
Steve wrote that Abbott Homes was the territory for a gang called the Black Gangster Disciples at the time, the BGDs. They monitored the halls, elevators, and the stairs. And the buildings often turned into a battleground between the BGDs and another gang, the Vice Lords. Steve found that in 1986, a year before Ruthie Mae's murder, residents in the projects experienced killings, rapes, and attacks more than twice as often as the rest of the city.
Gangs fighting over turf, that led to more violence, that led to more guns.
That's why Deborah didn't question the gunfire until the following morning when Ruthie Mae didn't come to visit like she normally did.
And I kept saying, is something wrong? But she would have knocked on my door and told me she was going.
Ruthie Mae normally stopped at Deborah's apartment at least twice a day. She let Deborah know when she was leaving and when she got home. But that day, she never knocked.
It was shocking because she's going to go to the store every day. She's going to go to that store.
For the first time, Ruthie Mae didn't follow her routine. This was a bad sign.
And I knocked on her door, and I didn't hear nothing. And then I decided, I said, something's wrong. It's not like her.
Deborah marched downstairs, out of the building and down the block to ask the building's management if they could check on her friend. See, they would have a key, and she didn't. The Chicago Housing Authority, known as CHA, managed Abbott.
I went to housing, and they told me I had to see again, check again and see if she comes. She might be went somewhere.
She's hard to understand here, but she's saying that the CHA told her to check on her friend again, that maybe she stepped out. Deborah said the manager warned her that they could get in trouble for opening Ruthie Mae's apartment without her permission. When she couldn't get through to management, she called the cops.
I didn't feel like nobody cared. Because it took me all day long to get the police to come. It took me all day long.
The police hadn't come back on their own since the night before. Deborah's calls convinced them to try again.
The security guards from the Chicago Housing Authority met them at Ruthie Mae's door.
Steve said officers came ready to break down the door.
This time the police wanted to go in, they say, and check on Ruthie Mae. And the Chicago Housing Authority security force said, well, if you break down that door, the tenant may sue you.
For whatever reason, the police and CHA again disregard that the tenant herself had called 911, afraid because intruders were breaking into her apartment through the mirror. Despite that, Steve said that the guards only offered reasons not to break in.
Also, if you break down that door, somebody's going to have to secure it. We don't want to do that. So they kind of talked the police out of entering the apartment. Of course, the police could have entered the apartment then. It wasn't up to the CHA security staff.
For a second time, the Chicago police left without checking to see if Ruthie Mae McCoy was okay. We wanted to know why, so we reached out to the current CHA spokesperson. They told us that due to how long it's been since this happened, they have to refer us back to how the CHA answered these questions at the time. Back then, when Steve called the CHA's head of security to ask why they advised police not to break down the door, the director said, quote, "I don't have any answers." 2 days after Ruthie Mae was shot, Deborah finally got someone from the Chicago Housing Authority to open her friend's door.
It was somebody from CHA who did break into the apartment and found Ruthie Mae lying on her side in a pool of blood, decomposing.
And when they opened the door, you could smell it. It was so bad.
The man from the Housing Authority asked Deborah to wait by Ruthie Mae's door out in the hallway.
But then they came and told me we had to call the police.
Ruthie Mae was found in a bedroom. According to the medical examiner, she'd been shot 4 times.
And one of the gunshots, one of the bullets had severed her pulmonary artery, so he didn't believe she would have lived long.
We all want to believe that when we call authorities, help will be on the way. Ruthie Mae was left high and dry. And why that happened would be the subject of a lot of debate for months and even years after her murder. Murders reportedly happened so frequently in the projects that it wasn't always newsworthy. Ruthie Mae's murder would have fallen into obscurity, or it would have been overlooked like so many others, if not for one curious detail.
The fact that she had been killed by someone who came in through the hole in the wall where her medicine cabinet usually was.
The Chicago Tribune wrote a short news story a few weeks after the murder.
It was amazing to me that people had access to other apartments through the medicine cabinet in the adjacent apartment.
Steve Bogira saw that brief article in the Tribune and had a bunch of questions.
I thought, how could the Tribune not be intrigued enough to ask more about these circumstances?
Steve worked for the prestigious Tribune out of college before shifting to a legendary weekly paper, the Chicago Reader. It's kind of like Chicago's Village Voice and had a reputation for solid journalism.
I wanted to be downwardly mobile, but seriously, because I felt the Tribune was more interested in stories that appealed to the kinds of people they wanted to advertise to, people who lived along the lakefront in wealthier neighborhoods and in the suburbs.
But at the Chicago Reader, Steve was free to write the kinds of stories he wanted to write about folks like Ruthie Mae McCoy.
I was interested, for one thing, in whether this medicine cabinet break-in was unique. And I was also interested in how police could leave like they did.
More than a month after Ruthie Mae McCoy's murder, Steve Bogira drove to Abbott Homes. The project building was massive. In the center, there was this big open area with some trees lining the sidewalk. 7 15-story high-rises surrounded the oversized lawns. Made of brick, they all looked the same. Abbott Homes were first built in 1955, and while they might have been nice then, by the late 80s, residents said maintenance rarely fixed anything. Burnt-out light bulbs, broken elevators, and backed-up toilets. This was all a part of life. When Ruthie Mae moved in, many of the walls and ceilings were crumbling. Steve was used to visiting Chicago's projects for his stories. But as a thin white guy in his early 30s, who obviously wasn't from the neighborhood, Abbott's residents, who were 90% black, would give him the side eye.
This guy must be a social worker or a cop or looking for drugs, and eventually they would believe me that I was a reporter.
Steve stopped at Ruthie Mae's building.
I went up to the 11th floor, not thinking I'm going to be able to get into her apartment.
He said a janitor happened to be in the apartment cleaning up.
The door was open and I was able to go in.
Just like Helen, the graduate student in the first Candyman movie, Steve wanted to see the hole in the bathroom wall for himself.
I do remember going into the bathroom and looking at where the medicine cabinet was supposed to be. And there was a rectangular hole in the wall.
Why wasn't her cabinet even on the wall? After Ruthie Mae was killed, her family and friends realized that there had been clues that there was something about her apartment that scared her.
Her brother had visited her a couple of months before, and she said that her medicine cabinet was loose and he had put a couple of pieces of wood in there to try to fortify it. She didn't tell him anything about medicine cabinet break-ins. He says if she had, he would have, done what he could to get her out of the project.
Ruthie Mae's friend, Deborah, has a daughter named Mary. They lived down the hall from Ruthie Mae, and Mary used to hang out in Ruthie Mae's apartment. Not long before the murder, Mary noticed that Ruthie Mae kept a stick on hand, one heavy enough to be a weapon.
She had a stick that was sitting from her bedroom door to the bathroom door right there.
Mary remembered that one particular day when she was visiting, she went to use the bathroom, but Ruthie Mae stopped her.
She's like, no, don't touch it, don't touch it, don't. Get back over here. She's like, use it right here.
She pointed to a bucket. That's when Mary realized she'd been using a bucket to relieve herself. That's how scared she'd been in her own home.
It was a 5-gallon bucket. She had a garbage bag sitting there, and she had used it. And every day, we never know that we'd see her walk from my house to the incinerator. She was throwing that bag away.
Neither Ruthie Mae's best friend, her daughter, or Steve said they knew if Ruthie Mae ever explicitly told anyone why she was afraid. Here's Steve again.
I was struck by both how spooky it was, but also how outrageous it was. I mean, I knew from other stories I had done reporting in the projects, in high-rise projects, that people were living with great insecurity, great fear. But usually it was of, people could break through my front door. The idea that people could also break into their apartment through their bathroom, I mean, that really seemed awful to me for people to have to live with that.
Deborah and Mary both remember seeing young men coming in and out of the apartment next to Ruthie Mae's. Steve learned there was a connection between that apartment and the murder.
Hers was apartment 1109. The adjacent apartment was 1108. And the state's attorney's office had confiscated the medicine cabinet in the other apartment as evidence. The medicine cabinet in Ruthie Mae's apartment was never found.
When he visited Ruthie Mae's apartment, Steve picked up some of the papers that had been left on the floor in disarray.
Of course, I looked at them and found the connection to the Mount Sinai Psychiatric Center.
That's when he learned more about why people might not have believed Ruthie Mae. Apparently, she had struggled with her mental health in the past. But lately, she'd been responding to treatment and started pursuing her GED.
It was a tragedy what happened to her regardless, but it seemed to be especially tragic considering that she was making really good steps with her life. Ruthie Mae went to a year of high school and quit after that. And she started showing signs of mental illness in her early 20s. So could have been schizophrenia. That was never totally clear. But she was definitely paranoid. And she would be heard talking to herself in the street.
Steve said this was in 1986, a year before Ruthie Mae's murder. Her treatment at the psychiatric center was outpatient, which means she still lived at home while receiving care.
She was known in the project as Miss May, and she would curse strangers sometimes, but she got connected with a psychiatric center at Mount Sinai.
After going to the psychiatric center, Ruthie Mae was taking high school equivalency classes. It was a sign that she was looking toward the future.
She was in arts and crafts projects, group therapy. Most of the other clients in this center were also project residents. The director of the center said they were all dealing with the stress and deprivation of living in that project.
The conditions that Steve learned about and the system's failure to help Ruthie Mae led him to pose a provocative question in one of his headlines. It read, What killed Ruthie Mae McCoy? A bullet in the chest or life in the projects? That headline is very close to the one that shows up in the Candyman movie in 1992.
In the movie, they showed a Chicago Dispatch headline, "What Killed Ruthie Jean? Life in the Projects."
Steve noticed how close it was to his own headline, but he didn't overthink it. After all, in the movie's credits, it says that Candyman is based on a fictional story called The Forbidden, written by Clive Barker in 1985. Clive Barker's story depicts a graduate student named Helen investigating an urban legend who haunts a dilapidated housing project in Liverpool, England.
It wasn't like they were doing a movie that was totally about the story I wrote. They had a different agenda. They were tying this real story to urban legend.
Bernard Rose, who wrote and directed Candyman, decided to set the story in the Chicago housing projects instead. Rose didn't play a role in Clive Barker's story, but Rose made it a central theme of Candyman. In the movie, Candyman is actually Daniel Robitaille, a black man from the late 1800s who was lynched for having a relationship with a white woman. Here's the director himself, Bernard Rose.
The Candyman is kind of a golem, you know? He's an avenging angel as much as he's anything.
How did that backstory become a part of his narrative?
The point was that he was wealthy and that he thought he was assimilated and he thought he was accepted. But he wasn't. And they killed him. And so now he's there, out there, not exactly looking for vengeance, but looking for something, looking to just to haunt them.
It's visceral. And maybe that's why Candyman still has this hold on us. It has served as the basis for 4 films.
Honestly, I didn't watch the 1992 movie until after I saw the newer 2021 Candyman movie.
This is Morgan Canty. She's a field producer at 48 Hours, and she's actually the one who came up with the idea for this podcast.
And after watching that movie, I was just really hooked. So I decided to do a little bit of research, and I learned that Ruthie Mae had suffered this horrible fate, and I just wanted to know more about why.
Yeah, her death sounded crazy to me, too, the first time I heard it. It kind of pissed me off, to be honest with you.
Right? It just felt like she didn't have to die.
Exactly. And that's why I wanted to do this podcast, just to understand how the intruders could have killed Ruthie Mae, get to the bottom of why she died, and how her circumstances contributed to what happened.
So, Dometi, when you were a kid in Chicago, how large did Candyman loom for you?
I mean, it was huge. I was scared of Candyman. I mean, the fact that all you had to do was say a name into a bathroom mirror and they could pop up. To be honest, I didn't even watch the film in full until you brought it to me.
Really? I didn't realize that.
No, facts. And Steve Bagheera's like me. He didn't see the film until much later. Not because he was scared of Candyman like a young Dometi, but it was because he wasn't a fan of horror films. He said that his biggest takeaway when he finally did watch the movie wasn't the commonalities between his story and parts of the film.
I was struck by the fact that what is a nightmare to white people was reality to people who were living in the projects.
I'll admit that sounds dramatic, but let me tell you, he is really not exaggerating here. I'd find out that a lot of that first Candyman film came from real life, not just Ruthie Mae's murder. Ruthie Mae lived in taxpayer-funded housing with conditions bad enough to inspire a horror film. But how is it that people's living conditions were ever allowed to get this bad in America? Why weren't residents better protected? And why weren't Ruthie Mae's calls for help taken more seriously?
A good part of my reporting dealt with the police response or lack of response, which, as many residents in the project told me, was not surprising.
There were all kinds of factors that Steve and those close to Ruthie Mae believed contributed to the tragedy.
Maybe if police came in right away, there was nothing they could do for her anyway. We'll never know.
While they didn't break into the apartment, police did start a hunt for who killed Ruthie Mae. And Steve went on a search of his own to find out how unusual it was for an intruder to come through the bathroom mirror at Abbott Homes.
There hadn't been another murder through this kind of an entry, but there had been numerous burglaries through the medicine cabinets.
This wasn't the first time criminals had preyed on residents like this. Coming up, we're going to look at the conditions residents like Ruthie Mae were living in.
If you really believed in tough on crime, then you wouldn't make it easy to crawl into medicine cabinets and kill our women.
What explanation did authorities have for not immediately helping Ruthie Mae?
There are a lot of calls to 911 from the projects that are hoax calls, phony calls.
What made her a target in the first place?
If people think you have money, yes, they would try to rob people.
We'll follow the murder investigation and talk to one of the lead detectives.
And I said, Jesus Christ, look at this. And there was no medicine cabinet on the other side.
And we'll talk to the writer and director of Candyman, who has long downplayed the connection between Ruthie Mae's death and the story that made it to the big screen.
You take things from the world around you and put them into new forms. That's really what fiction is.
Ruthie Mae McCoy was murdered in spring of 1987 in her apartment, and the circumstances around her killing didn't make sense from the very beginning. Ruthie Mae tried to explain the break-in during the 911 call, but the dispatcher didn't seem to grasp what she was really saying.
They want to break in.
Yeah, they throw the cabinets down.
She said they threw down her cabinet. Ruthie Mae was likely trying to tell the dispatcher that intruders were coming in through her bathroom mirror, which, to be fair, does sound absurd. The dispatcher might have been confused. I wondered if that was the reason they didn't take Ruthie Mae's 911 call more seriously.
You know, you lock your front door, somebody could still try to break in, but you feel some sense of security.
Reporter Steve Bagheera discovered that even though Ruthie Mae might have been the first person murdered this way, at least that we know about, this was not the first time criminals entered through a bathroom mirror in the Chicago projects.
There had been numerous burglaries.
Some residents even said they caught a few thieves red-handed.
One person told me that she was watching TV with a friend, and all of a sudden a kid runs out of her bathroom through her apartment and out the door. And she goes into the bathroom, and there's another kid stuck in a pipe chase. The second kid, who was a little bit heavier, was having a hard time getting through. So they caught him and called police, and he confessed that, they were trying to sneak in the apartment that way.
Believe it or not, the fact that the medicine cabinet could come off the wall wasn't by accident. This was by design. The Grace Abbott homes opened in 1955. During the planning of this building, the architects added a space called a pipe chase. This space was just wide enough for a person.
The adjacent apartments had medicine cabinets that were back to back with a pipe chase in between. That is an area where janitors could work on the plumbing if they took down the medicine cabinet.
That was the upside for a janitor. The problem is, it will become the perfect entry point for criminals and a potential nightmare for residents. Why didn't the Chicago Housing Authority do anything to stop these break-ins in the 80s? What responsibility did they have for Ruthie Mae's murder? I'm Dometi Pongo. From 48 Hours, this is Candyman, the true story behind the bathroom mirror murder. Episode 2, Deadly Design. When 911 gets a call, they've got to decide how urgent a situation is. That April night, a desperate grandmother was reporting that strangers had broken into her home. But the dispatcher logged Ruthie Mae's call as a disturbance with a neighbor. Later, much later, the police would acknowledge that if the call had been labeled a robbery, they would have likely responded differently. Journalist Steve Bagheera questioned the Chicago Police Department at the time and asked why Ruthie Mae's call for help didn't generate a faster police response, or at the very least, convince cops that they had to break down her door to help her. This is what they told him.
There are a lot of calls to 911 from the projects that are hoax calls, phony calls. They get to the project and they check into it and nothing's happening.
Steve said that after so many false alarms, officers approach calls with a little skepticism.
They maintain that it had to be a factor that the responding officers took into account when they decided not to break into Ruthie Mae's apartment to see what was going on.
That was the official response.
There haven't been any studies showing that calls from the projects are more likely to be hoaxes. Now, if you ask the residents, they said that police are afraid of the projects just like we are. And the residents also said police just don't care about people here. We're all poor. Why should they care about us? So that was the feeling that they had about why police responded the way they did to Ruthie Mae.
Steve couldn't find much to back up the official explanation. He wondered if some of the hoax calls were actually complaints made by residents who then backtracked because they were scared. They probably didn't want people knowing that they were talking to the police. Back in 1987, the police department wouldn't let Steve speak to the officers who actually responded to the call. In the past few months, we've reached out to those who are still alive, but haven't heard back. Steve said he did talk to the police superintendent at the time of the murder and said that he defended his officer's decision not to enter Ruthie Mae's apartment.
He at least acknowledged it was a close call, as he put it. It was a coin flip, that maybe they should have gone in. But he said, you have this information, and in hindsight, you know that somebody got killed there. These officers didn't know that. They didn't hear anything. They had at least one household on the 11th floor who said they hadn't heard anything.
Steve still didn't think that seemed like a good enough reason not to break in.
And I thought that was more of an excuse than a valid reason. And again, I felt it was like, is this how you would respond if it was a white middle-class neighborhood where a woman called and reported that somebody had broken in on her in any form? Would you get there and knock, and if nobody answered, just leave? Especially when you had other calls reporting gunshots? Would police just leave because it might be a hoax? Yeah, that's just not just policing. It's not fair.
Steve quickly figured out that response time wasn't the only way that the police and the Chicago Housing Authority, or CHA, might have neglected Ruthie Mae.
Well, according to Ruthie Mae's daughter, Ruthie Mae had one attempted break-in through the medicine cabinet route the previous year and had reported it, and CHA had done nothing about it.
When Steve asked about it, the CHA claimed that they had no record of this complaint. So Steve started digging.
I started hearing about these break-ins that people were doing. And these break-ins had been reported to the Chicago Housing Authority. The CHA tried to minimize how many there were.
It turns out other residents complained to the CHA about break-ins through their medicine cabinets.
I remember the spokesperson told me in the 18 months before Ruthie Mae was killed, they got reports of at most 10, probably only 7 break-ins via medicine cabinets.
7 break-ins through bathroom mirrors. Sounds like a lot to me. But Steve says that he was told that count is still probably too low.
The police commander in the district said, well, you have to triple whatever the reports are because so many break-ins don't even get reported to us.
So if you take the police commander's advice and triple the number of break-ins?
There was between 21 and 30 in the 18 months before Ruthie Mae was killed. And what had the Chicago Housing Authority done about this? Nothing.
And the longer this security problem went unchecked, the more commonplace these break-ins will become.
If you're in your apartment, you take down the medicine cabinet, crawl through the pipe chase, kick in the other medicine cabinet, and do the burglary. And that's the route that apparently was not uncommon in 1987.
Steve wondered what it would take to fix these medicine cabinets to protect residents.
A janitor I spoke with in the project said it wouldn't be hard to secure these. You'd have to bolt the cabinets to each other. It would make it harder for plumbers to work on the plumbing, but at least people would be safe from that kind of an intrusion.
The CHA didn't do that.
The janitor said, well, I'm not surprised. We can't even get light bulbs from the agency. We have so many backed up toilets and crumbling ceilings, and there's been so much deferred maintenance that they're not going to work on a problem with undue haste.
Steve questioned how the housing authority could let these conditions go on for so long, knowing that their neglect made it easier for drug dealers to deal out of apartments and for intruders to run rampant throughout the building. Why wouldn't the CHA protect its own residents?
The Chicago Housing Authority was not any more committed to keeping the projects open. They were eager for their demise, I think, so they weren't in a rush to get a legal tenant into these apartments.
Ruthie Mae McCoy never even wanted to live at Abbott.
She asked specifically in a letter to the CHA that it not be in a high-rise project.
Steve said that she asked not to be in a high-rise because she didn't want to have to walk up so many stairs. She only moved in after her apartment in another project flooded.
She got a response that there's this apartment available to you on the 11th floor of a high-rise, the Abbott Homes. That's all that was available.
Chicago Public Housing is offered to low-income residents.
She was on welfare, which then paid $140 or $150 a month. The project apartment would cost $46 a month. She simply couldn't afford anything else, which was why she moved into the Abbott Homes.
This is when she met Deborah Lastly, who said she moved on to the 11th floor with her kids. She had a total of 7. Deborah moved in about 6 months before Ruthie Mae for a heartbreaking reason.
My husband had committed suicide. I left our home. I couldn't stay there no more.
Both Deborah and Ruthie Mae felt public housing was their only choice. In fact, the day Deborah moved in, the elevator broke.
So me and my kids had to walk our stuff up. Now, I wasn't used to that, but we made it.
Maintenance in the building was so slow to respond that Deborah taught herself how to fix the plumbing.
I didn't know how to do it at first, but every time you would call them and say the toilet stopped up or whatever, it might be a month before they come and do it.
I mean, come on, a month to fix a toilet? 2 years after Ruthie Mae was killed, 48 Hours gave viewers a first-hand look at these poor conditions.
The Chicago Housing Authority has been such a notorious failure that in 1987, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, currently swept up by its own scandals, threatened an outright takeover.
Harold Dow was the reporter covering the story.
The scale and precision is that of a military operation. But this is Chicago, and these cops are launching an attack on one of the city's own housing developments.
I'm in a police state now.
You think this look like a bunch of happy campers there?
It's called Operation Sweep, and it's Chicago's high-powered, high-profile approach to cleaning up public housing.
He even got gang members to agree to be interviewed.
What kind of drugs does your gang sell here?
Cocaine. Joe is a high-ranking member of the King Cobras. He's been in the gang for 20 years.
Your gang heavily armed?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of weapons do you guys?
Automatics, revolvers, the whole works.
The baddest game out today is the dope game. Brothers killing brothers over, over drugs.
The original goal of public housing wasn't to turn into this nightmare. But how were these problems allowed to persist? Finding that answer involved turning to people who know Chicago's history. I reached out to Sherman Thomas, or as everyone calls him, Dilla.
Hello, here for the tour?
Yeah.
Hop aboard.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Dilla is an urban historian who posts popular videos online. He's got over 100,000 followers on TikTok and offers bus tours of the city through his company, Mahogany.
Today we're going to go to a very proud Mexican-American neighborhood called Pilsen.
Dilla is well aware of Ruthie Mae's story.
She was living in something that was rushed to be built. She was living in something that wasn't structurally sound.
The horrible conditions he and the residents describe are actually the opposite of the vision laid out by the Chicago Housing Authority for these projects.
The Chicago Housing Authority was supposed to provide real quality housing for those who just needed a stepping stone.
The Chicago Housing Authority opened its doors in 1938 to mostly low-income white people.
That was before the war, before the mass migration of rural Negroes from the South. Then the racial pattern of the city changed, and so did the kind of public housing that was built. This is Chicago's solution for the poor.
The early units, built in the first half of the 20th century, weren't high-rises.
They were built with green space in mind, right? So they had these big, huge courtyards, and each unit had a backyard where you'd be able to plant your own garden and your own vegetables. In fact, when I'm going through newspaper archives, both of those housing projects would win the citywide garden competitions.
Dilla said things started to change in the 1950s as Chicago's African-American population grew.
Segregation is literally etched in the fabric of Chicago, right? Like how we define our 77 neighborhoods. What separates Fuller Park from Bridgeport is the fact that Black folks couldn't pass that particular street.
From 1910 until the 1970s, nearly 6 million African Americans had moved north in what is referred to as the Great Migration.
I think there was a lot of pushback about a lot of Black families moving into Chicago who hadn't been there before.
That is Sue Popkin. Popkin has written 4 books about Chicago public housing and understands the system like the back of her hand. I mean, at one point, she had information no one else in city government had access to.
For a while, I had the only list of addresses that the Housing Authority had.
She's now at a think tank called the Urban Institute and still studies, you guessed it, Chicago public housing. She said the government began funding housing projects during the Great Depression. But these architectural dreams were met with the realities of funding and the realities of the Chicago political machine.
Man-made jungles of concrete, conceived and administered not by people who live in them, but by political appointees, most of whom live elsewhere.
Again, here's the historian, Dilla.
That was built rushed, right, with shoddy material and with cheapness in mind. And so, as it relates to plumbing, sometimes if you have a plumbing issue, plumbers got to come in, cut a hole in your wall, and then put a whole new wall up. Well, CHA didn't want to have to go through that and be spending money on drywall of all things, right, or plaster.
Popkin said that funding started to dry up after World War II when the federal government provided fewer subsidies for public housing. And while funding was an issue, she said that in Chicago, corruption played a part in cheapening the buildings from the very start.
They were built very badly. There were all kinds of deals with the unions.
Despite the infamous winters in the city, she said there were high-rises where they didn't even enclose the hallways.
Which then almost immediately created a hazard, both the danger of people falling and people throwing things off of them. And so then they enclosed those with gates, basically, with fencing. So they looked like prisons.
Free people living in housing that looked like a prison. It was a lot.
The mayor of Chicago, Jane Byrne, is causing quite a stir with her latest move, the move from one apartment to another, an apartment 10 blocks from her present one. But it isn't how far the mayor's moving, it's where, from a luxury apartment to a housing project known mainly for crime and gang warfare.
In 1981, Chicago's mayor at the time, Jane Byrne, moved herself and her husband into Cabrini Green for 3 weeks in hopes of drawing attention to the conditions.
I'm really not afraid over there at all. And I think what you have to prove is that you don't have to be afraid. And I'd like to stimulate that with the people that live there. If people want to say that it's vote getting or whatever they want to say, then I would suggest that whoever says it take the next apartment.
Some called it a brave move, while others called it a publicity stunt. Well, not long after her move-in, the Chicago Housing Authority did get more national attention. The then chairman of the CHA, Charles Swibel, who was also a major fundraiser for the mayor, was accused by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development of corruption. Here's Sue Popkin again.
Charles Swibel, who took the money that was supposed to go for maintenance, funneled it through the Flat Janitors Union and used it to build Marina City, which is a luxury high-rise along the river.
The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, accused Charles Swibel of making deals that benefited people he dealt with in his private real estate ventures, instead of prioritizing the needs of the CHA. In fact, HUD threatened to withhold millions of dollars unless he was removed. Swibel never admitted any wrongdoing and was never found guilty of crimes connected to the CHA. He resigned from his chairmanship after 19 years and died in 1990. Popkin said whether the money was lost due to policy decisions or corruption, the residents on the receiving end got the message loud and clear.
I think that it was never about what was good for the tenants or the families, right?
A lot of that robbed us of our sense of deserving of nurture, of kindness, of the minimal that you could give us to make us safe.
Kim Fox lived in the Chicago projects when she was growing up.
Don't have access for people into our homes through our medicine cabinets.
Fox is now the Cook County State's attorney, the Chicago area's top prosecutor. Before she ever became part of law enforcement, Fox grew up in Cabrini Green. While Robert Taylor Homes was the largest project, Cabrini Green is the most famous, thanks in large part to TV and movies. It was a high-rise not much different than Abbott Homes, and it was used in the opening credits of the TV show Good Times and would later be used to horrify audiences in Candyman. Did you see Candyman when it first came out in 92?
I did.
Do you remember going to the show to see it and what your thoughts were?
The fact that it was set in Cabrini, I will tell you, I initially was like, what's this? Right? Like, what is this? I wasn't enthused about the backdrop.
Yeah.
Like, and that the backdrop to a horror film. To horror.
She was in college at the time in another part of Illinois, and this film was her friend's introduction to where she grew up.
And so I'm going to be honest, I felt some kind of way.
And you're about to equate my childhood with horror. And this is now going to be what you at a cocktail party, the first thing you say.
Was it like that, Kim? Were you scared like that?
Instead, Kim prefers to talk about the folks who lived in Cabrini Green.
The people were amazing. Where we were living was not.
Fox lived there in the 1970s and 1980s. And even when she moved, much of her family remained.
You were trained as a young girl not to get on elevators with men by yourself or darkened elevators. And so many times, we'd have to walk up 8 flights of stairs or 10 flights of stairs, that there would be literally fecal, like there'd be in the corners in the stairwells. That presence of like disgust physically was there.
She talked about how the building was in disrepair, like how the incinerators on each floor couldn't even burn the trash.
You'd have the smell of trash or it would catch fire. And you would have the smell of fire.
It probably comes as no surprise that growing up in that kind of environment takes its toll on you.
When it is baked into every layer of your existence, like not built in, physically built into the architecture of your existence, that we will find ways to make you vulnerable and know it and do nothing about it. That hardening is survival. That's survival.
That's survival instinct. The need to take care of yourself because the authorities won't help is what led Deborah to fix her own plumbing. And it's likely why Ruthie Mae used a bucket as a toilet. Fox wasn't surprised that the Chicago Housing Authority ignored Ruthie Mae's complaint about the bathroom mirror. She said none of the residents thought the CHA or the police would be helpful.
And so it was just this weird dynamic. Like, people didn't rock with the police, and people were also scared. People were also wanting to be safe, but there was never a sense that we had that the police were going to do that for us. Never.
She said you had to rely on your crew, like Deborah did for Ruthie Mae.
My cousin became a really good electrician. We were building carpenters.
Reporter Steve Bagheera did what he could to hold the CHA accountable. After he'd written his story about Ruthie Mae, he kept asking about the medicine cabinets.
I was still calling them, asking what they were doing. And their spokesperson said, yeah, we've got it on the agenda to secure these medicine cabinets. But I knew some of the residents who lived in these apartments at the end of the hall where they had a vacant apartment next to them. And so I could check with them, have they done anything yet?
Steve's first story about Ruthie Mae came out September 3rd, 1987. Sometime after that, they fixed the problem. While Steve was asking questions about policy, police were focused on building a case. Who could have been in that vacant apartment next to Ruthie Mae's? Who did investigators suspect came through that bathroom mirror? When Steve went to visit Ruthie Mae McCoy's apartment, he walked into her bathroom and could see a hole where the medicine cabinet would normally be.
I could see that route through the pipe chase that the killers apparently had taken.
He could poke his head through and see the narrow walkway. Steve said they never found Ruthie Mae's medicine cabinet, but they did find the one in the adjacent apartment. According to the police, crime lab technicians dusted that one for prints and inventoried the cabinet into evidence. During his visit to Abbott, other residents told Steve that they would put things up against their bathroom doors to protect themselves at night.
This woman told me about somebody running out of her bathroom one night, and after that, she was putting furniture in front of the bathroom door at night when she went to bed, and I heard that from other tenants as well. People who wanted to make sure nobody, if they broke into their bathroom, they wouldn't get any further than that.
The police interviewed Deborah Lastly and Ruthie Mae's daughter, Vernita, who would have been in her mid-20s in 1987. During their investigation, the police asked Vernita if her mom was having problems with the neighbors, and she told them she didn't know. Police noted that Vernita told them that Ruthie Mae had two 19-inch TVs, but on the scene, they only found one. Her rocking chair was also stolen. Police found one bullet casing from a 9mm cartridge behind the bedroom door. Detectives talked to Ruthie Mae's neighbors and interviewed residents in the building.
I'm sure they were hearing dozens of stories about how this crime had occurred.
Ruthie Mae's autopsy revealed brutal details of what happened.
Ruthie Mae, according to the medical examiner, had been shot 4 times.
The medical examiner wrote that Ruthie Mae was shot in her arms, her chest, abdomen, and leg. Investigators took photos, blood samples, and recovered one spent bullet at the scene.
One of the bullets had severed her pulmonary artery, so he didn't believe she would have lived long. Maybe if police came in right away, there was nothing they could do for her anyway. We'll never know.
If you ask Deborah, Ruthie Mae's neighbor, her friend's murder was preventable.
I was lucky. And so I kept telling my mother, I'm lucky.
Deborah's apartment was not at the end of the hall, which meant it couldn't be accessed through the bathroom mirror. But after Ruthie Mae's death, she still told her kids that they needed to move. Understandably, she was spooked.
How can they come through a mirror and go in there and do that?
Kids in the building nicknamed Deborah Mother Teresa, both because she'd give food away, but also because she would blare gospel music as a way to keep teens from wanting to hang out on the 11th floor.
You play a lot of music that they don't like, but I didn't care.
Deborah was cautious about living in the projects, so she never took the time to get to know many of her neighbors on the floor. She kept to herself. That's why she didn't stop and think about the group of boys who would be going in and out of the apartment next to Ruthie Mae's. The people Deborah saw or heard in that hallway, the ones that she scared away using loud music, might have been customers stopping at apartment 1108 to buy drugs.
So there were people in and out, and the night before, there was a lot of this traffic as well.
Reporter Steve Bagheera said that the police wanted to identify any of the people seen coming and going from that apartment. Cops said they asked a lot of residents, and they all gave the same names.
Hondras and Turner were the only names that kept coming up.
Police heard the names John Hondras and Edward Turner from residents. Hondras was 25. Turner was 19. Both were young black men who had been seen spending time in the apartment that could connect to Ruthie Mae's. The police had found a key witness who claimed he saw both of them go into her apartment. And they believe they discovered a reason Ruthie Mae might have been a target.
There was the impression that word had gotten out that Ruthie Mae had a little money in that apartment.
From day one, it was clear Ruthie Mae McCoy's murder wasn't going to be an open and shut case. Reporter Steve Bagheera, who wrote for the Chicago Reader, recognized early on that making sense of what happened that night in April 1987 was going to be difficult for detectives.
It's a tough case for police, in large part because the relationship between police and the residents of these projects.
Most residents already had a fraught relationship with the police. But even for the ones who were willing to talk, how could they be sure detectives would protect them from retaliation? Finding witnesses would be a challenge. But that wasn't the only reason. The motive itself was a mystery. Of the thousands of residents at Abbott Homes, why was this grandmother killed? Was this random? Or was she targeted? To find clues, detectives started digging into where Ruthie Mae spent her time. Steve Bagheera says she suffered from severe paranoia, so
she got connected with a psychiatric center at Mount Sinai.
Ruthie Mae got enrolled in an outpatient treatment facility through the hospital to take care of her mental health. And after a lifetime of struggle, Ruthie Mae was finally beginning to make headway. She started taking high school equivalency classes to get her GED, and the psychiatric center even helped her take a big step toward moving out of the projects.
The people at that center realized that she qualified because of her mental illness for supplemental security income.
According to Steve, that increased her Social Security checks from about $150 a month to about $350.
This would allow her eventually to get out of the project, which was what she wanted. She wanted to be able to get back out there in private housing, and she couldn't afford anything extravagant, but she could afford to live outside the project.
This new income ended up being a windfall.
The first check she got included some retroactive pay, retroactive to the time she had applied. So she got a check for $1,979, I believe it was, which I believe she cashed and kept the money in her apartment.
She bought herself a couple nice things.
Like a plain winter coat and a couple of other things.
Which unfortunately also made her a target.
Detectives came to feel that people in the project probably noticed and thought she had some money in the apartment, and that may be the reason that they broke in on her.
Listen, when you're hungry, anyone on the come-up starts to look like food, and the community at Abbott Homes was starving. In a phone interview, Ruthie Mae's neighbor, Deborah Lastly, remembered when her friend got that check.
She went to the mailbox, I know. She said she was going down there, and she was happy.
She said that Ruthie Mae wasn't too loud when she told her about the check, but that it is possible that someone heard. So detectives began thinking that Ruthie Mae's big payday might have been a motive for murder.
So it could be that the thing that the psychiatric center did to help Ruthie Mae possibly move out of the project got her killed instead.
But what detectives felt and what they could prove were two different things.
The stories changed several times. My partner and I very seldom took notes the first time around because they were always usually lies.
I'm Dometi Pongo. From 48 Hours, this is Candyman, the true story behind the bathroom mirror murder. Episode 3, The Suspects Next Door.
I was upset that she had to lay in her own apartment for 2 days before somebody found her. Nobody deserves that.
Former detective Anthony Menina investigated the murder of Ruthie Mae McCoy.
It was our case, myself, Ray Loiser, and Bill Wright.
Back in 1987, Menina would have been in his early 40s.
I was a detective in homicide from 1985 to 1995 when I retired.
He's from Chicago. He grew up on the West Side.
As a matter of fact, the projects that we're talking about were very close to where I lived.
He and Detective Ray Loiser were partners for nearly 8 years.
We used to have our own way of doing things. The ability to think alike and to know what each other is thinking just with a look.
The detectives were assigned the case soon after Ruthie Mae's body was found. Menina had worked many cases out of Abbott homes and was very familiar with it.
There were a lot of good people that lived in them projects.
But even as they approached the brick high-rise, they stayed on high alert.
When you were going in, you had to be very careful looking up at the windows because people would be dropping stuff on you all day long. Garbage at you or throwing different things out the windows at you.
They also avoided the elevators.
At the time, good policemen never used the elevators in them projects. For lack of a better term, they were moving urinals and hardly ever worked right. So it was a dangerous situation.
Menina wasn't one of the responding officers, but he put the blame on the Chicago Housing Authority and the CHA's security for being difficult about opening Ruthie Mae's door. The project manager for Ruthie Mae's building later said she didn't know why the first key given to police didn't work.
That really upset me. I was ranting and raving against the CHA police at that time because of that fact.
He says that there were a lot of hoax calls that came into the police department, but says he still didn't believe that that was a good excuse for the slow response.
Well, he tried to get in with a key and couldn't do it. Hey, go back somewhere and get a locksmith and get in there.
He didn't want the police to let Ruthie Mae down again.
I said, here, this poor woman got killed in her own apartment, not bothering anybody. So we worked our butts off to try to clear that one, and we did within 2 days. The city of Chicago, that particular time, had over 900 homicides for the year. So, I mean, it's like we were working a different homicide every day. So, therefore, you couldn't hand the case off to other detectives because they were busy going on another one.
24-hour shifts happened regularly.
We were considered Area 4. That was the entire west side.
The detectives started asking everyone they could find what they knew about the night Ruthie Mae was killed.
Then we found witnesses doing a canvass that heard the shots. They heard 3 or 4 shots, and they started talking about who was in their apartment.
The witnesses repeated the same 2 names, Edward Turner, who was nicknamed Montefiore, and then John Hondras, who went by White Boy.
They were both named. The stories changed several times, which my partner and I very seldom took notes the first time around because they were always usually lies.
The detective's strategy was to go around, talk to everyone, and then repeat all the questioning again.
And once you caught them in several lies, then you started getting to the basic facts and the truth.
The detective's key witness turned out to be 20-year-old Tim Brown. Brown was described as a scrawny guy back then. He told police that he saw Turner and Hondras come in and out of Ruthie Mae's apartment with a TV and a rocking chair. Menina and his partner had Brown come meet with an assistant state's attorney to create a written record of his version of events. Steve Bagheera has a copy of Brown's written statement.
Tim Brown said that he was with some friends that night, that afternoon, and that evening, leading up to the time when Ruthie Mae was killed.
Brown told the detectives that he regularly hung out in the apartment next to Ruthie Mae's, 1108. And this day was no different.
There were young men, primarily men, but sometimes women were in the apartment as well, getting high. And they were selling drugs from this apartment.
Tim Brown told the police that he'd been there with a friend earlier in the day. And that afternoon, they moved some weights from another apartment up to 1108 to work out. Brown's girlfriend was there too. She left at 6 to go to her grandmother's house, while Brown and his friend stayed, sitting around and listening to the stereo.
Tim Brown said that Miss May, as he called her, had asked him earlier in the year if they could keep the noise down from the apartment.
A number of guys were in 1108, pretty late into the evening. Brown told the police who had come through that night: John Hondras, Edward Turner, and a friend nicknamed Bo. At one point, as the night wore on, he said Bo wanted to show Hondras what he learned about the medicine cabinets in Abbott homes.
Bo told Hondras that the bathroom mirror opened to the next apartment, to apartment 1109, and that was how people broke into apartments.
It would be that easy to get into the neighboring apartment, where Ruthie Mae, the woman with the nice things, lived.
So a little later that evening, Hondras and Turner were back in the bathroom, according to Brown, and Hondras pulled the mirror in 1108 out with his hands.
Edward Turner was a teenager who lived in Abbott homes. His family knew Ruthie Mae.
Turner had grown up, I believe, in the projects. Hondras had spent some time there as well.
John Hondras, the man who allegedly pulled the mirror out in 1108, was 21 and an ex-con.
He was a tough character. The other guy was more of a thief than anything else.
Hondras had done time in an Indiana prison for robbery and auto theft. That night, after the medicine cabinet was removed, Hondras and Turner could allegedly look straight into Ruthie Mae's apartment.
And it looked to them like maybe the apartment next door was vacant.
In a statement to police, Brown claims that he warned Hondras that Miss Mae lived there. But the apartment, at least at first, looked empty.
Hondras said back to Brown, according to Brown, that he didn't think anyone was home. And then he climbed on the sink and went through the hole. Brown said that he then heard a lady say, "Who's there?"
After hearing the voice, Brown then claimed that he heard the front door to Ruthie Mae's apartment, 1109, open.
And then a knock on 1108. And so he answers the door, and Hondras tells him to throw him the jacket, his jacket. So Brown gives him his jacket. It was a black nylon jacket. Hondras threw it over his head and went back into 1109 through the front door this time.
So by now, one suspect was in Ruthie Mae's apartment. That's what Brown told the cops. He also said he saw the second suspect, Edward Turner, go through the hole in the wall. And that's when things supposedly went off the rails.
And he heard Turner say, "Get down." And then Brown said he heard 4 shots.
4 shots, then silence. Five or 10 minutes later, he said both Turner and Hondras left Ruthie Mae's apartment. But Brown said they didn't leave empty-handed.
He saw Turner come out with a TV and Hondras come out with a rocking chair.
Brown claimed that both of them took the stolen property and made a run for it.
Detectives talked to a couple of women who lived on the 6th floor of the same building, who said that Hondras and Turner came to them with the TV and the rocking chair.
One of the young women in the apartment that night, Lynette Fitch, was Tim Brown's girlfriend. She told the police that Hondras wanted them to stash the stolen items at her place.
He had come into her apartment and tried to leave the rocking chair and the TV in her apartment, and she wouldn't allow it.
And she suggested that they try another woman who lived on the 1st floor of another Abbott high-rise. And they ultimately took the TV and rocking chair to this woman's apartment. She acknowledged to the police that she had agreed to take the TV and the rocking chair to hold it for Hondras and Turner.
After they found a place to hide the stolen goods, Brown said that they came back to the 11th floor.
According to Brown's statement, 2 or 3 hours later, Hondras and Turner knocked on 1108. And when Tim Brown answered, Hondras said they needed to go back to Miss Mae's apartment to get the shells from the gun.
Brown didn't want them to crawl back through the bathroom mirror, so he told the police he said no.
They went into her apartment through the front door and came out About 5 minutes later, Andres told Brown they had found 3 of the shells. They locked the door behind them and then ran down the hall.
Cops found 1 shell casing behind the bedroom door. But other parts of Brown's statement didn't entirely match what police officers experienced. See, Brown claimed this happened after 11:30 at night, but police had already shown up to Ruthie Mae's apartment after she called 911 at 8:45. And when they showed up, the front door was locked, not unlocked the way Brown described. The police never recovered the gun or any fingerprints.
Police didn't have this physical evidence, and they also had given a head start to the offenders to get their stories solid.
But Brown's statement and the statements of the other witnesses made detectives confident that Andres and Turner were their prime suspects.
There was testimony saying they went in there and come out with 3 bullet casings, and the TV and the rocking chair were found at the one guy's mother's house. Come on.
Detectives stopped at Turner's house and spoke with his mom, Aletha Turner.
We left business cards and I kind of talked her into calling us when he returned home. A while later, she called us that they were waiting for us. So we went back to the 1407 troop, and that's when he was placed into custody.
He was arrested on April 25th, his 19th birthday.
Meanwhile, Andres, the ex-convict, managed to avoid arrest for more than a month. Police finally caught up with him on June 8th, 1987. Both Andres and Turner denied being involved in the murder of Ruthie Mae. Menina remembers Turner giving a couple different stories as to how he found the TV.
The first story, he said that he had found the TV out by the incinerator. Then the next story was he found it outside the door, until we finally got him to admit that he got it out of the apartment.
The prosecution planned to rely on their key witness, Tim Brown, who was adamant that Andres and Turner were the culprits.
It was within 2 days that we solved it.
Andres and Turner each faced charges of burglary and murder and would have to wait years for their day in court. They both pleaded not guilty. In the meantime, Ruthie Mae's family pursued another kind of justice. They believed she might still be alive if the Chicago Housing Authority had designed the medicine cabinets differently. So Dometi McCoy, Ruthie Mae's daughter, wanted the CHA to pay for what happened. So she got herself a lawyer.
Well, her mother died, and her mother died by way of a bizarre set of facts. And Mr. Peters, can you help me? And I said, I don't know, but I'll try.
The day after Ruthie Mae called 911, her daughter Vernita tried getting in touch with her. She called Ruthie Mae, not realizing that her mom was already gone. Vernita said her aunt was the one who eventually broke the news.
She just didn't understand, nor did I, how the hell something like this happened and was permitted to happen.
That's attorney Randy Peters. He'd eventually end up representing Vernita when she sued the Chicago Housing Authority. Randy also grew up in Chicago.
While I was still figuring out what I wanted to do, I saw a movie called All the President's Men.
All the President's Men tells the story of 2 Washington Post reporters who uncovered the details of the Watergate scandal. Their reporting helped lead to President Richard Nixon's resignation.
And that movie, for whatever the reasons it may have been, just got me interested in law. My father is a factory worker, was a factory worker. Mother was a housewife. No lawyers in our family. But that movie really touched me, so I decided that maybe I'll give it a shot.
He was in his mid-30s back in 1987 and still pretty new to law. At that point in his career, Randy said he took on several cases against the Chicago Housing Authority. And one of his clients was Dometi McCoy. She's since died, but Vernita was just 25 when she lost her mother.
I just assured her that I would do everything I can.
Randy said he agreed to take the case because he was horrified by the circumstances Ruthie Mae was living in.
The bizarre facts of what happened. I mean, how many people do you know that live in an apartment building or a condominium have the worries and concerns about the adjoining unit being able to crawl through your medicine cabinet to get into your unit? Absolutely bizarre.
Randy knew that in order to win this case, he needed to prove that there was a problem long before Ruthie Mae was murdered.
You have to show notice of whatever the event was that caused, in this particular case, a death, and to be able to develop evidence to show that it was preventable. It was foreseeable and preventable.
And as Randy started looking at the way the housing projects were designed, he realized the medicine cabinets were not the only problem.
Where she was living was a CHA project that was not conducive to safety.
Too often, elevators didn't work, incinerators didn't work, and without incinerators burning up trash, the hallways smelled, and residents worried about an ever-growing fire hazard. There was also this problem of access for emergency vehicles. See, the high-rises had these huge courtyards that didn't allow for through traffic, which meant police and ambulances couldn't quickly drive up to the buildings.
So in other words, if someone wants to commit a crime in that area, the crime is committed and they're gone before the police can get to the location.
It was a mess. But Randy needed to prove that the Chicago Housing Authority purposely neglected these buildings, and that specifically, they did nothing to make Ruthie Mae's apartment safer. For his investigation, he did a couple of things. Randy filed a court order to get access to the police report and the names of the officers who reported to the scene. But then he went a step further. He brought in an architect to explain how the design of the buildings themselves posed a risk to residents.
I, for the life of me, couldn't figure out how somebody in Unit A could crawl through a medicine cabinet into Unit B.
He said that the architect looked at the structure of Abbott Homes and the way they built the pipe chase to give janitors that easy access to the pipes.
My architect was shocked when he saw how this was created, literally shocked. And not only shocked at that, but also shocked by the fact that the record showed that the CHA was on notice that this type of activity was happening, and nothing was done structurally to remedy that hazard.
At the time, the CHA told Steve Bagheera that they received, quote, only isolated reports of such break-ins. They estimated fewer than 10. Randy thought the evidence made this case a slam dunk. The police report and the architect gave him what he needed.
And with those facts, then it gave me the opportunity to show that there was negligence on the part of the CHA by permitting this ease of access to continue.
Randy believed the CHA had multiple ways to safeguard the projects, and certainly the medicine cabinets.
And it was easily preventable by way of either altering the design of the medicine cabinets by hinges and nails and locks or whatever to prevent them from removing it from the wall, and or number two, because of the history of this type of activity occurring, to have adequate security that was present as a deterrent, neither of which they had.
Randy said the CHA denied having any liability. At the end of the day, Randy thought that all of this came down to one thing.
Money.
Once Randy thought he had a strong case,
the question became, what's it worth? We have to take a look at how we could maximize the amount of recovery for any individual, whether they be black, white, rich, poor.
In April 1988, he sued the Chicago Housing Authority, demanding $1.5 million for the death of Ruthie Mae McCoy.
She was somebody's mother, and she was loved, and she was respected, for who she was.
He didn't actually expect to win $1.5 million. In these kinds of lawsuits, the amount you get depends on a number of factors: a person's assets, their social status, if they have dependents. And Ruthie Mae didn't. By then, Vernita was an adult. And unfortunately, Ruthie Mae was
unemployed, issues with mental handicaps, not married, poor, and it comes down to, unfortunately, lawyers in these types of cases have to put a value on a life.
But Randy said that this case wasn't about money. This was about accountability.
It didn't become a question in my mind of, I'm going to make a lot of money on this case, because I knew I wasn't.
His goal was to get the CHA to admit it had failed.
By way of getting the estate compensated to some degree, to show them that there was some remorse and some sorrow, so to speak, of what they were experiencing.
And some restitution for the people that Ruthie Mae cared for. While she wasn't technically a dependent at 26 years of age, Vernita did have hardships, and Randy tried to argue that Ruthie Mae would pitch in however she could with the limited resources she did have.
She was there to help her daughter with her grandchild, and to me, that was more important than anything else.
But even outside of trying to get the family compensated, Randy just wanted the CHA to actually fix the remaining medicine cabinets.
I just kept looking at the facts of this case, and this just isn't right. I mean, if I don't do something about this and at least try to get them back on track to get their act together, this is just going to keep on happening. And other people are going to be murdered.
According to Steve Bagheera's conversations with officers, the mode of entry was well known.
In the McCoy matter, the vulnerability came by way of the police learning, and me learning, that there was a pattern of this type of activity happening. And, it was only a matter of time until Ruthie Mae became a victim.
By the way, a spokesperson for the CHA had told Steve Bagheera that they had no record of Ruthie Mae complaining about her medicine cabinet. Still, Randy was going to make his case. And the question for him was, would the CHA pay for what he and Ruthie Mae's family saw as their fatal neglect? The family's lawsuit against the CHA was happening at the same time prosecutors were building their case against Ruthie Mae's alleged killers. For Randy, the criminal investigation was key to proving his case, because the police report showed a pattern.
I didn't hire the police department to do their investigation. I didn't even speak to them. I didn't even know about what their findings were until I got their papers, but they were quite helpful.
Remember, the CHA admitted they knew of some break-ins. The detectives on Ruthie Mae's case said it was common knowledge among residents. Here's Detective Anthony Menina.
I had talked to several people at the time, and they say, well, there's a designing flaw in there, and that's what the burglars are using to climb into different apartments. That was in conversation with several either informants or other people that just wanted to stick their 2 cents in, so to speak.
The fact that Randy's case was built on information that investigators gathered themselves made it that much stronger in court. Randy filed in April 1988, but the case didn't resolve until 1992. However, it never came before a judge or a jury. Instead, the Chicago Housing Authority decided to settle.
You have to understand, in a criminal case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not the premise in a civil case such as my case. In my case, the burden of proof that needs to be established is what is more probably true than not.
Randy said he no longer has his files from this case since it's been more than 3 decades since they settled. We filed a Freedom of Information request with the CHA for the settlement amount, but that hasn't turned anything up yet. The CHA explained that most records from that time have been destroyed. However, Randy was confident that they did not get the $1.5 million he demanded when he first filed.
No, absolutely not. That I can tell you with certainty, but I can't tell you how much we did get.
He also said the CHA never admitted liability. I spoke with Vernita McCoy's daughter, Keely. but she didn't share how much money the family got in the settlement either. Back in the 80s, Steve Bagheera wondered if the lawsuit contributed to the CHA finally fixing the remaining medicine cabinets. He'd still been asking about them, even after his first article was published.
I was still checking, but they all said that there hadn't been any attempt to fix the medicine cabinets. I think they'd probably made attempts after Vernita, Ruthie Mae's daughter, filed her lawsuit, but it sure took time for them to do something about it.
The CHA's public affairs director told Steve that the CHA desperately wanted to provide better security, but it was hampered by years of deferred maintenance costs. She said they were trying to solve it step by step. While Steve wrote about the lawsuit for his story, his focus was on the impending trials of John Hondras and Edward Turner. Detectives had believed that the Social Security check Ruthie Mae received contributed to the robbery. However, that money wasn't mentioned in the statement given by the prosecution's key witness, Tim Brown. And Steve, who followed the case for years, didn't think the criminal case was as much of a slam dunk as the lawsuit.
There was not proof beyond a reasonable doubt in my mind.
In the early 90s, Ruthie Mae's family continued to mourn their loss as they waited for the suspects' trials. Meanwhile, in England, a director was trying to get his new horror movie off the ground.
It was one of those weird pieces of kind of kismet.
Bernard Rose decided to set his next film, Candyman, in the Chicago projects. But how did the details of a real murder, barely covered in the press, make their way into his script? I'll tell you this much, it's not because he called and reached out to the family. So, what actually happened? Next time on Candyman, the true story behind the bathroom mirror murder.
I'm not a fan of horror movies.
Reporter Steve Bagheera didn't know how details from his stories made their way into the original Candyman film until after it was released. His first article came out in 1987.
They came in through the bathroom mirror, a murder in the projects.
The two suspects, John Hondras and Edward Turner, had been arrested. Years passed before they finally got their day in court. And while they were awaiting trial, a British director was developing a new movie. We're going to step away from the pursuit of justice in Ruthie Mae McCoy's case and focus for a moment on how her story made it to the big screen.
I had actually gotten either a phone call or a letter back when people wrote letters from somebody in Hollywood saying, we're doing this movie that's based in a housing project in Chicago.
Back in the early 90s, reporter Steve Bagheera got an ask from Hollywood. He doesn't remember the person's name, but the Hollywood rep asked Steve to be their guide when they visited Chicago.
We understand that you're an expert on the projects, and could you show us around when we come to town to film? And we'll give you, I don't remember what it was, but it was like a couple $100 in a screen credit.
The last thing Steve wanted to do was support a movie that made light of the project's living conditions or that trivialized the murder of Ruthie Mae. He'd been pitched before about turning Ruthie Mae's story into a movie, but at that first meeting, Steve was told that the main character of the film couldn't be Ruthie Mae or someone in the projects. The person making the pitch thought that the protagonist would have to be white for the film to even have a chance at getting made. And Steve wasn't a fan of that idea. He'd gotten to know Ruthie Mae's family and spent years trying to hold the police and the Chicago Housing Authority accountable for her death. He wasn't going to trust just anybody. So when the second Hollywood type reached out,
I said, send me the script, and if it's not an exploitive movie, I will probably help you out.
Ultimately, Steve never helped anyone put Ruthie Mae's story on the big screen. But her story still became part of a cult classic. What Steve didn't know was, while he was following the prosecution of the two men arrested for killing Ruthie Mae, production on the first Candyman film was already in gear.
It must have been a couple of years after Candyman came out. Somebody told me, hey, there's stuff in here that seems to be from the story you wrote. That's when I watched the movie.
He noticed that a young Virginia Madsen with curly blonde hair was the lead. She ended up playing the curious graduate student who parachutes into the projects.
The main character was a white woman, and this story I had done, at least, was about a black woman.
How did a movie about the horrors of a black housing complex end up centering on a white outsider? And how did elements of Ruthie Mae's story end up in the Candyman film? This period, after her death and before the trial, is when writer and director Bernard Rose started working on Candyman. He was the only person who could really answer my questions. We reached out and waited. Then, one June afternoon, we finally got the chance to talk.
It's always a pleasure to talk about Candyman from a different angle.
Rose told me how he found out about Ruthie Mae's story and didn't shy away from defending himself to critics.
I can see why people think, oh, why are they taking these details from this? But look, that's what fiction is.
I'm Dometi Pongo. From 48 Hours, this is Candyman, the true story behind the bathroom mirror murder. Episode 4, based on a true story.
I wasn't trying to make a thesis, I was trying to make an entertaining horror film.
Bernard Rose wrote and directed the original Candyman that came out in 1992. He's talking to me on a Zoom from West Hollywood, wearing glasses and an all-black shirt. Rose has a graying goatee and an easygoing vibe. He told me he would have never predicted that his Candyman would still have an audience decades later.
It feels like it has a much bigger shadow now than then.
Before I asked him about Ruthie Mae McCoy and how parts of her story ended up in his movie, I wanted to know how he got the idea for Candyman in the first place. You'll remember, the movie's primary source material and the work that's officially credited in the film is Clive Barker's short story called The Forbidden.
I knew Clive Barker. I knew him socially, actually, when I'd been doing another film at Pinewood Studios.
According to Rose, he met Barker for lunch while they were both working at the same production studio. Critics liked Rose's first feature film, Paper House. It was a dark fantasy, and he was looking for a new project when he came across Barker's story, The Forbidden.
I read that and I thought, you know what, this actually really works as a story. This is a great and interesting story.
Rose, now in his 60s, is originally from London, if you didn't catch that accent. He told me that he'd always thought that a horror film needed a supernatural element. That's what appealed to him about The Forbidden, which is about a graduate student named Helen who investigates urban legends.
It's set basically in a district of just outside of Liverpool called Kirby, which is very full of low-income housing and what they call in England council housing.
As Helen visits the council housing, she conjures up supernatural forces while working on a research paper.
I liked the fact that its heroine was an intellectual and she wasn't a kid.
All of this sounds familiar to anyone who has seen Candyman. But what I found really interesting was the reason Rose took a liking to this story. The director told me that he loved how Helen approached this undertaking from an analytical perspective, not an emotional one.
She was interested in this phenomenon of urban legends and what was going on in this housing project, but her interest wasn't to help people. It was to write a study, and I liked the kind of arrogance of that.
He actually liked that Helen had little empathy for the community she was researching. He thought that arrogance made the story work.
I think it's much more interesting to follow somebody who's flawed, and I think there's always an element of punishment in a horror film, that she gets into trouble, and it's like there has to be something that she's done wrong in a sense, and the thing that she's done wrong is she's poked her nose in where it wasn't really wanted,
For his movie, he kept this aspect of Helen. The character Virginia Madsen plays is a middle-class woman, essentially parachuting into a low-income neighborhood.
It was exactly the opposite of what they would have made you do in a kind of movie of the week TV film, where she would have been trying to help people. She's never trying to help people. She makes no effort to help anybody in the film.
He said that's a big part of the conflict.
She didn't understand and was actually in a weird way exploiting the interaction. She just wants to write a paper and get praised for it, you know?
Rose was inspired and thought this could be his next movie. His original plan was to keep the setting the same as Clive Barker's story, until the author himself suggested otherwise. Barker had also directed the film Hellraiser, and he had learned that American movie distributors sometimes balked at movie stars with thick accents.
The film was set in Liverpool, and Liverpool accents were just like beyond the pale for them.
So they decided to make the characters American. So according to Rose, if Hellraiser hadn't had a distribution problem, then Rose might never have set Candyman in Chicago. And in a way, I wouldn't be here talking about Ruthie Mae McCoy today. In his first draft, Rose hadn't thought of Chicago yet. He hadn't even set Candyman in any particular city.
It was just a Midwestern city. It could have been anywhere. It could have been St. Louis. I don't know. It could have been Milwaukee.
His approach to the story changed after he decided to actually visit locations.
I wanted to go scout somewhere and do some research, and I ended up going to Chicago mostly because I'd been there and I remembered how spectacular the buildings were. I mean, it was that shallow, you know. It's a spectacular looking city, right?
And it's biased, but I agree.
It's a city of architects, really.
It is.
And it's a city where architecture is very important.
His interest in the architecture stood out to me since how the projects were designed is so crucial to how Ruthie Mae died and to the movie itself. Rose might not have clocked that yet, but when he went to Chicago, he started on a journey that would lead him to hearing about the murder of Ruthie Mae McCoy. Rose wanted to visit the projects.
The people from the Illinois Film Office were nervous about taking me there.
See, they weren't just nervous. They were downright terrified. And their fear would end up becoming a big part of the original Candyman movie. For people who have seen Candyman, it's odd to think Bernard Rose's first script didn't mention race at all. The conflict was just about class originally, which might make sense for someone writing from a British perspective, where race and class might not be as inextricably linked. But in America, you can't talk about class inequities without talking about race, too. And definitely not in the highly segregated city of Chicago. In the final version of Rose's script, Helen has a black friend who is also middle class that goes with her to visit the projects.
She feels as alienated from the people in the projects as Helen does, except that she's more embarrassed at Helen's behavior because she understands that it's embarrassing to behave this way.
Race takes center stage in Rose's movie, whether he intended it that way or not. Janet Maslin of the New York Times put it this way in her review. She writes, "The horror unfolds inside a housing project and plays out provocatively against a backdrop of racial injustice. In the movie, the killer is a reincarnation of a well-to-do black man who was tortured and lynched by a mob in the 1800s. Daniel Robitaille's crime was dating a white man's daughter. The mob hunts him down, beats him, chops off his hand, and smears his battered body with honey before bees sting him to death. The lynching is graphic. But all of those plot details were only added after Bernard Rose went to Chicago."
I contacted the people who were at the Illinois Film Office, and certainly in that era, if you said you wanted to come in and potentially shoot a film in a city, they would show you around. And they would always ask you for a list of locations as to what your film needed. And, you know, top of the list was housing projects. The first place they took me was Cabrini Green.
He said they also took him to another project, but not Grace Abbott, where Ruthie Mae had lived.
I don't think I ever went there.
Rose was surprised by how nervous the people from the Illinois Film Office seemed as they took him to visit Cabrini Green, which was the closest project to downtown.
No project is more notorious than Cabrini Green. The 23 high-rise buildings of Cabrini, with their 15,000 residents, are described as a chamber of horrors. The occupants are terrorized day and night by vandals and teenage gangs. 7,000 families are on a waiting list for public housing in Chicago, but 400 units at Cabrini Green have been vacated by families trying to escape the lawlessness.
Those CBS News reports were from 1970. By then, between media attention and its depiction in TV shows, Cabrini began to have quite the reputation.
In Cabrini Green at the time, there was a police station in the middle of the project. And I think we had to go there, and then we were escorted around the place by an officer, you know? And they didn't think it was safe to go there otherwise. That was their attitude.
Were you taken aback by that?
Yeah, extremely, to be honest with you. I was shocked. And of course, when somebody has that kind of drama around going into what is basically just an apartment block. I mean, it's not really any more complicated than that. It's a bunch of apartment blocks.
He said the upper floors were empty, and he had to admit, the buildings were creepy.
There was an atmosphere there of fear, but the fear was not from the people who lived there. The fear was the people from the Illinois Film Commission and the cops. And that really kind of shocked me. I thought, wow, there's something here. Because one of the first key tenets of making a successful horror film is having a scary setting. I thought, these people are scared of going here.
Did they tell you anything about why they were so scared of this community?
They basically said there were groups of gangs that held the neighborhood hostage.
During his visit, Rose was able to talk with cops who policed the buildings on a day-to-day basis.
I learned that actually the danger was exaggerated, and that in itself was part of the racism that surrounded the place. And what is the primary component of racism is fear, right?
Outsiders were afraid of the people who lived there, afraid of what could happen there. Their prejudice stoked their fear.
What the cops said to me is if you're a white person walking around here, they're not actually going to bother you at all because they're going to assume you're a social worker or a cop.
Rose worked these details from his own experience into the script. In Candyman, Helen gets mistaken for a cop when she's seen in the projects.
When I rewrote it set as about Cabrini Green, and I just used everything I'd seen and heard.
That decision to replicate these fears on screen is a choice that has sparked debate. Debate from scholars like Robin Means Coleman.
30 or more years that we've been having a conversation about race and class in this movie.
Coleman is a professor at the University of Virginia and a media studies scholar. She's written 2 books on Black people in horror films and turned one into a documentary. Both books, Horror Noir and The Black Guy Dies First, mention Candyman.
There are 2 films that I watch a lot. It's the 92 Candyman and The Thing.
She's been debating Candyman for the last 30 years, and she understands that not everyone gets the controversies around this movie.
We've got to address the skeptics who are like, it was just a movie, and he saw a headline, and it was, a narrative vehicle to get her into Cabrini Green. How else are we going to do that? But Ruthie Mae McCoy is a real life person. Her family are alive and out there. And what we have are entertainers who snatch someone's story, real life horrific murder, for entertainment purposes.
Back when she was writing the first edition of her book, Horror Noir, Coleman wanted to pick a real life story turned into film. She wasn't sure whether to write about Ruthie Mae or Jeffrey Dahmer.
And if you read the first edition of the book, I go with Jeffrey Dahmer. Ruthie Mae felt, I think at that time I was writing it, it felt too close to home. It felt like Ruthie Mae, Ms. May, as they called her. That could have easily been me, my mother, my grandmother.
Coleman and I talked about how Candyman doesn't actually grapple with the horror of people's lives in the projects with nuance. I mean, even without knowing the director's intentions, a lot of Black folks watching this movie could tell that the conversations about race were a bit of an afterthought. Back in 1992, when the film was released, Coleman said critics' reviews were mixed.
There were 2 responses to Candyman, and one I remember was from Carl Franklin.
Carl Franklin is a black filmmaker, famous for the Denzel Washington movie, Devil in a Blue Dress.
And Carl Franklin said, seriously, we're doing the black boogeyman, brutal buck trope in this movie, again, where the obsession is over this white woman who we're sort of putting on a pedestal.
In this critique, Candyman is, of course, the black boogeyman. It's a trope that seizes on fear by perpetuating a portrayal of black men as violent and menacing, often chasing white women, like the Candyman chases Helen. The trope goes all the way back to Hollywood's first blockbuster film, The Birth of a Nation, which depicts the KKK and is blamed for inspiring a spike in real-life lynchings and race riots.
Do we need yet another movie that glorifies that kind of stereotype, that kind of trope?
Roger Ebert, who was white, had a different opinion. Based in Chicago, Ebert was a well-respected movie critic.
Roger Ebert, on the other hand, said, you know, like if you have to do horror, this is the kind of horror you want to see, right? Ebert is saying, I do like the sort of social issues, social consciousness horror, something that leaves me thinking and reflecting.
What's interesting is that Bernard Rose told me he didn't go into this film wanting to send any kind of message. But there were signs that he knew that what he was making touched a nerve.
I was in post-production on Candyman. At the time, it was April 1992.
Parts of Los Angeles were on fire.
In Los Angeles, the deadly aftermath of the Rodney King verdict, violence, arson, and anguished cries.
Riots broke out across the city after white police officers were acquitted of excessive force. The public outrage stemmed from the fact that these officers were caught on videotape brutally beating this black motorist. His name was Rodney King.
We were supposed to have a test screening somewhere that week, and the riots started happening and people got very frightened. And I was mixing in a stage in Hollywood, and the mixer was grinding through the scene with the dog and the blood and all this.
Rose is describing a gruesome scene where Candyman had cut off a dog's head in a project apartment.
And I said, I'm not happy with that. You need to go back and change something. And he said, no, I'm not going back. I'm not changing it because I'm not looking at this film anymore.
Rose was warned that the film might be, quote, a bit too much. And that test screening never happened.
And then the film got released without it, which is probably a good thing, because who knows what they might have made me take out.
What he did include, he told me, largely came from his visits to Cabrini Green. During his first visit with the Illinois Film Office, he connected with a woman who lived there.
We bumped into a lady who had her kid in a stroller, whose name was Henrietta Thomas, who was like asking us what we were doing, basically.
He explained how he was working on a movie.
I told her it was about this sort of mythical kind of monster that haunted the place kind of thing. And she was basically saying, oh yeah, well, you know, that's true, by the way.
And what was she talking about?
She said, oh, there are like ghosts and demons that haunt this place.
The director realized Candyman could haunt a place like this, too. This idea went back to something from Clive Barker's The Forbidden.
So really, the whole thesis that Clive had, that people who live in situations which make them uncomfortable, it's not uncommon for them to create something that's worse and more uncontrollable, because in a weird way it makes them feel safer.
During his visits to the projects with the Illinois Film Office, Rose asked the tenant he'd met, Henrietta, if he could come back to Cabrini Green on his own.
I thought, okay, I'm going to just call her after we've left and just go there on my own and see what really happens.
The two had dinner, and he got to see Cabrini Green from a tenant's perspective. Rose decided to hire Henrietta to be a consultant on the film and based a character on her, too. The character's name is Anne-Marie. And in the movie, a major plot point is when Candyman steals Anne-Marie's child. As for the real person,
she had a young kid, and it was just a place that she lived that honestly she liked living because it was near downtown Chicago.
Rose said that she was actually the first person to bring up the details of Ruthie Mae's murder.
It was she who told me the story about the medicine cabinets and that somebody had been killed in another home that had a similar design with the floor with the medicine cabinets, and you could get in and out the apartments, and that someone had broken in and killed somebody. She told me that story and said that that was something that disturbed her.
It was the kind of violation that was visceral and memorable.
I thought all this detail is so rich, and it grounds the film. And, you know, if you want to make something scary, it has to be recognizable.
But when the art is that recognizable, when the art represents real trauma, it has to be handled with care.
We might be having a different conversation even if at the end of the film it said, in memory of Ruthie Mae, right? Or read more about, and we've got models for this.
She pointed to Steve Bagheera as one of those models.
When he's writing his article and he writes subsequent articles, he doesn't point back to his own journalism. He says, learn more about housing projects, learn more about how this happened.
Meanwhile, the director wanted to unnerve people and knew that he was parachuting into the projects just like his movie's protagonist, Helen.
So I was essentially doing what Helen does in the film. I was like walking around, gathering things for my own benefit.
But where did he gather so many details about Ruthie Mae's murder? He said Henrietta told him that someone came in through a medicine cabinet and killed a woman. But that's not how he learned Ruthie Mae's name. What does he have to say to folks who believe that his film exploited Ruthie Mae's killing?
It's not the same murder as that murder. That was an entirely unrelated event. It's just that really the only thing that's taken is the detail of the bathroom cabinets. It was one of those weird pieces of kind of kismet. I think I was in the hotel and I literally opened the Chicago Reader and there was an article about it.
Director Bernard Rose had come to Chicago to visit Cabrini Green, and a tenant had told him about this murder where a killer or killers came in through a medicine cabinet. He happened to be visiting the city just when Steve Bagheera's second article about Ruthie Mae McCoy's life and murder was published, July 1990.
If you missed that issue of the Reader, unless you had gone to a library and looked it up on a microfilm, you would never find it.
So in his movie, that's what Helen, the blonde grad student, does.
She goes to the library and looks it up on a microfilm.
Do you remember the title of the article that you read that caught your attention?
I mean, it's very similar to the depiction in the movie. Something like what killed whatever the lady's real name was, life in the projects with a question mark. I think that was it.
That lady was, of course, Ruthie Mae McCoy. I reached out to her granddaughter, Keely, but she declined to talk to us for this podcast, based partly on her past experiences with media. Keely had seen her family's story misrepresented in the news before. She said while a film was being made that mentioned Ruthie Mae's killing, her mom, Vernita, was dealing with the real-life aftermath of Ruthie Mae's death.
And, I mean, obviously the actual murder itself has nothing to do with Candyman. Somebody came in and shot her, right?
Yes, but there is the character of Ruthie Jean, that is the name of the film, which is obviously very similar to Ruthie Mae. Was that a conscious decision?
I mean, it probably was, yeah. It's always very complicated when something's a true story.
I look at these parallels with Ruthie Mae's story, and, you think about the family or Ruthie Mae's daughter, and they looking at the film and feeling like these elements are reminiscent of what happened to Ruthie Mae, but they felt like they weren't a part of the process. What would you say to that critique?
I mean, I think that's valid.
Rose said that he never considered making one of Ruthie Mae's relatives a consultant on the film, and points out that his movie is about Candyman, not Ruthie Mae.
It's not about that person, not about the real person at all, And it is ultimately a fictitious fantasy. They uses some authentic details in part, but it's not about any real person at all.
I'm going to push back a little bit, and forgive me, Bernard, but when you go back and look, we went and checked out Anne Marie in The Forbidden. Her last name isn't McCoy, so McCoy comes only in the Candyman film, and that seems part of the lineage of Ruthie Mae, who, again, the movie is Ruthie Mae, Ruthie Jean, and then you got Anne Marie, the resident, who's Anne Marie McCoy. So then you see these names kind of play into it, and I know, I assume you would describe it as a dotted line, not a straight line connection between the real murder. But if I'm the family, I'm looking and I'm seeing these connections, and I feel as though I should at least be a part of the process.
I mean, I can see how you could feel like that. But if it was a film about what happened to her, the real person. But this clearly is not.
To be honest, he's right in some respect. I mean, this movie isn't solely about Ruthie Mae. She's a plot point to get to the story of Candyman. But I'm not sure that he understands why turning her into a plot point can be considered by some as dehumanizing. Instead, he tries to argue that that's how movies like his get made.
You take things from the world around you and put them into new forms. That's really what fiction is. It's not any cleverer than that.
Rose didn't have any memory of ever reaching out to Steve Bagheera either. He said it's possible the producers contacted him, but he was never made aware.
I have no direct memory or knowledge of that because, as I said, I had already hired Henrietta as the consultant, so it's entirely possible that someone suggested him.
Rose didn't set out to make a racially charged movie that included inspirations from real people and events. It just ended up that way.
The film has been criticized at different times over the years for saying, it's this, it's that, it's got the wrong perspective, blah, blah, blah.
He's talking about the criticisms Coleman mentioned, about how the movie feeds into anti-Black stereotypes.
I think that, yes, it is uncomfortable in places. And I think if it wasn't, it wouldn't have lasted. If something ceases to create debate, it dies.
I asked how he decided the line between inspiration and exploitation. His answer, again, reminded me a little bit of how he described the character Helen's approach.
Well, I think that if you take anything, whatever you do with it, there's an element of exploitation. And you have to just accept that's what you're doing. The only way to really be non-exploitative is not to do anything. Because we're all, to some degree, driving past car accidents and staring at them.
His argument is that this is the messy part of making art. Rose thinks anyone who claims to feel guilty for taking their inspiration from the real world is probably lying.
Do they feel guilty about it? And they might pretend they do. I don't think they do. I think there is a little difference when you're dealing with actual victims of actual crimes, that's really what you're talking about. But even then, I don't know. They'd never have sold a newspaper if it wasn't for crime.
The true crime genre gets a lot of criticism for exploiting other people's tragedies for entertainment. Some of the same reasons we've been challenging Rose. And in true crime, like this podcast, we are sharing the details of Ruthie Mae's life. In fact, we're sharing more than Bernard Rose ever did. But the key difference to me is that our ultimate goal is to inform and to help people understand how tragedies like these can happen, to put them in their proper context. So I try to ask myself whenever I'm reporting, how would this victim's family feel? How would I feel? In fact, a lot of times I'm reporting on my own community. I may even be connected to the victims in some way. So I do my best to be accurate and respectful. That said, I have to admit that a part of me feels like Candyman does a disservice by not properly acknowledging these real tragedies. Coleman wasn't surprised by what the director told me.
He's a filmmaker. He's like, look, I made an entertaining movie. This is what he does. But I mentioned it's important to go back to Steve Bagheera.
She brought back up the story about Steve meeting with an actor who told him the protagonist would have to be white for the film to get made.
And they do exactly what Steve cautions them against doing.
At times, Steve felt strange in general about being a white man writing about people of color.
I totally understand the feeling that it's wrong that people who are poor, and in this case black, at that time at least, the stories were told by white people.
But he also knew these stories were being overlooked by mainstream outlets.
I always felt like it was better that it was told by someone, and that I would do my best to faithfully represent what their experience was like.
For Rose, keeping Ruthie Mae's story alive is now part of the film's legacy.
So there is a memorializing effect, and that's got to be positive. But you know, look, I can't imagine how traumatic it is for family members to have to deal with someone in their family that's murdered. It's almost like what the Candyman says. What's worse? Is it worse to be forgotten or to be remembered? Well, the Candyman, he kills so as not to be forgotten. That's his whole motivation.
He sheds innocent blood to keep people talking about him.
If people remember what happened, that can never be bad, in my opinion. I think when things are forgotten or denied, that seems the unhealthy thing to me.
Keeping Ruthie Mae's memory alive also means that the failed housing policies of Chicago's past can't be swept under the rug.
The heart of any problem was that the housing authority had allowed these buildings to rot.
To Rose's point, there is a chance I wouldn't be talking about Ruthie Mae's murder if not for this film. And while Candyman turned me onto the case, her murder and the trials of the two men arrested for her killing are what we'll cover next. Edward Turner and John Hondras pleaded not guilty to the charges of murder and robbery. Their names had come up repeatedly as police talked to the residents of the project building where Ruthie Mae was killed.
I can understand that from a detective's point of view, that you would hone in on the two people who are mentioned regularly. But of course, that doesn't mean that they did it.
Steve Bagheera attended the trial.
The state's attorneys had a little bit more evidence against Turner, so they made it technically a death penalty case.
Prosecution's case relied heavily on a 6-page statement from a witness named Tim Brown. Their plan was to have him take the stand and repeat the chain of events the state's attorney wrote down when they interviewed him. But suddenly, Tim Brown wasn't so sure what he saw that night.
He got on the stand and flipped on the state's attorneys.
That's next time on Candyman, the true story behind the bathroom mirror murder. Ruthie Mae McCoy died in the spring of 1987. A month later, just as summer was heating up, Hondras and Turner were indicted. They were charged with murder, armed robbery, home invasion, residential burglary, and armed violence. It took 3 years for Edward Turner and John Hondras to go on trial after their arrest for the murder of Ruthie Mae McCoy.
They didn't have physical evidence to help them.
No useful fingerprints were found at the scene. Ruthie Mae's medicine cabinet was missing. Plus, investigators never recovered the gun and got a late start securing the crime scene.
Another problem with the police not going in to the apartment originally is that by the time they got back there, the place had been wiped clean.
The case largely hinged on the prosecution's star witness, Tim Brown. Brown told police that he saw Hondras and Turner go into Ruthie Mae's apartment. The two suspects spent all 3 years waiting behind bars. Steve Bagheera found out that Hondras lost 3 relatives while he was waiting for his trial in this case. First, his grandfather. Then, his mother died of cancer. And just 2 days after her funeral, a police officer shot and killed Hondras' 16-year-old brother. Authorities told Hondras' family that he was too dangerous to be released for the funerals, so he never got to say goodbye. John Hondras was in his mid-20s, and he'd been to prison before. He was convicted of auto theft and robbery. Detectives were told he had only been a free man for less than a week when Ruthie Mae was shot. Edward Turner was just 18 when Ruthie Mae was killed. In the past, Turner, a high school senior, had been charged with unlawful use of a weapon. His mother, Aletha Turner, said that he liked to listen to the radio with friends and never gave in when other young men pressured him to join a gang. She said Turner never would have hurt Ruthie Mae. They knew her and used to live in the same high-rise. The two suspects chose to have their fates decided differently. Turner wanted a jury of his peers, while Hondras went with the bench trial, so a judge would decide whether he was guilty or innocent. When they finally went to trial, reporter Steve Bagheera was still on the case.
Even though Turner had opted for a jury and Hondras was going to have his fate determined by the judge, Michael Getty. They're going on at the same time, so you have a lot going on.
They both had Judge Michael Getty, and each suspect had pleaded not guilty. The court decided to have both trials at the same time in the same room. Now, if there was a moment that was specific to only Hondras' case, they would escort Turner's jury out of the courtroom temporarily.
There were some relatives and friends of the defendants. The only person there on behalf of Ruthie Mae was her brother, Willie McCoy.
Steve and Willie often talked while court was in recess.
I really enjoyed talking with Willie McCoy. He was a born-again Christian who said he had had his problems before he was born again. He was messing with drugs.
At the time of the trials, Willie was 57. Even though he was Ruthie Mae's older brother, he said sometimes she would help him with his schoolwork back in the day. He said his sister was generous. Willie told Steve that she would have given you the shoestrings off her shoes if you needed them.
He clearly loved Ruthie Mae, and that came across. And he was like a lot of people who do come in support of the victim. He was not all about vengeance, like, we got to get these people convicted.
Steve said Willie had mellowed out with age. He witnessed an example of this in the courtroom. A friend of Edward Turner's family asked Willie point blank if he thought Turner had really killed Ruthie Mae.
McCoy shrugged, and the friend said, I'll tell you truthfully, I don't believe he did, but if he did do this, I hope he burns, because if someone did this to my mother, they wouldn't be here in court. I'll tell you that.
Steve is reading from his own reporting.
And Willie McCoy then smiled and he said, I know what you mean. I used to feel that way too, but I've grown some. I understand, the friend said. And then McCoy told me that he wasn't always as forgiving as he is today. Had his sister been murdered like this when he was younger, he told me I would have gone over and tore the whole West Side up. I'd have found the people who did it and blew their brains out and kept walking.
Willie came to almost every day of the trials.
I liked what he had to say because he was ambivalent, because he knew how the world worked.
Steve and Willie understood there was no guarantee these suspects would be convicted.
He was not naive. And yet he also had this compassion, this understanding of what life is like, how people can get messed up in things that they don't want to get messed up in.
No one, not Steve, not the loved ones of the suspects, and certainly not the prosecution, could have predicted what would happen next.
The prosecution was hanging this case on the statement that Tim Brown had given them.
The prosecution's star witness changed his story. I'm Dometi Pongo from 48 Hours. This is Candyman, the true story behind the bathroom mirror murder. Episode 5, The Wavering Witness. No other reporter has followed what happened to Ruthie Mae McCoy more closely than Steve Bagheera.
I feel like I got to know Ruthie Mae somewhat, in spite of her death.
Steve and I spent hours on a Zoom one Wednesday afternoon.
She came here from Arkansas when she was young.
Steve was thin with white hair and was wearing a button-up shirt. Just off screen, he had several stacks of his old notes. Occasionally, he'd pause the interview, grab his glasses, and read through his reporting to make sure he was getting the story right. In his decade spent reporting in Chicago, he'd covered plenty of trials.
The Cook County Criminal Courthouse, now known as the Layton Courthouse, is commonly known as 26 in California. That's where it is, on the southwest side of the city. And it's the biggest and busiest felony courthouse in the country.
The courthouse stood 7 stories, adorned with cement-colored neoclassical stone columns. And the place had a chill to it. Fluorescent lighting, gruff security guards, a tense screening process. There was a sense of foreboding in there, just thinking about the decisions happening behind each set of doors.
It's not a pleasant place to be. It's a courthouse where white people, if they experience it at all, it's because they got jury duty. Whereas a lot of poor black people know the place pretty intimately. They know where the Coke machines are.
Thankfully, I can count on one hand the number of times I've been to 26 in California, and none were pleasant. The most recent was in 2018, when I was reporting on the trial of a white police officer found guilty of fatally shooting a black teenager 16 times.
A lot of people also just want to stay away from 26 in California if they can. Bad things happen down there. That's how people look at it.
So as odd as it might sound, I'm not surprised only a small group watched the Turner and Hondros trials.
Very few people were spectating, watching, or there in support of the defendants, were there for the victim.
Edward Turner's mother, Aletha, was there, and Ruthie Mae's brother, Willie, too. No other reporters covered the trial, according to Steve.
There wasn't broad interest in this case in public.
Were you struck at all that it was just Willie who attended on the part of Ruthie Mae?
Yes, absolutely was. Ruthie Mae's daughter, Vernita, for whatever reason, did not attend.
I have seen situations where sometimes just to relive in the court case, the pain of it all can be a lot for people, but, you know.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can think, what good is it going to do for me to see what happens in the trial? It might not be what I'd like to have happen. Then I'll just get hurt worse.
On March 27, 1990, the 2 defendants, Turner and Hondros, arrived in court wearing dark suits. Turner, 21 by then, was clean-shaven with a short haircut. Steve wrote that he sat stiff and expressionless at the defense table. By then, Hondros was 25. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and had his hair pulled back into a ponytail. Because Hondros had 3 prior felonies, he faced up to 80 years if convicted. Turner faced an even more serious punishment.
The state's attorneys had a little bit more evidence against Turner, so they made it technically a death penalty case.
Multiple people told detectives that Turner had admitted he shot a woman the night Ruthie Mae was killed. Now, he hadn't said outright it was Ruthie Mae, but his alleged confession was the reason Turner faced the death penalty. Turner's lawyers argued that he didn't shoot anyone and that he was just a teenager lying to impress someone. Willie McCoy was called to the stand. He identified his sister's TV and rocking chair. After him, the Chicago Housing Authority project manager, who finally opened Ruthie Mae's door, testified. She didn't know why the key the police were given for Ruthie Mae's apartment hadn't worked. The prosecution also brought Sonia Moore up to the stand. She had lived in Abbott Homes, and at the time of the trial, she told Steve she was Turner's girlfriend. She testified that Turner came to her place the night Ruthie Mae was murdered, at around 10:30 that evening. He sat in her living room with her sister, and her sister's boyfriend. They were just hanging out when Turner started confessing that he shot a lady who had a daughter. That's what Moore said on the stand. This alleged confession was notable because it happened before anyone had opened the door to Ruthie Mae's apartment or found her bullet-riddled body. That night, Moore said she pressed Turner. She testified that she asked Turner where this woman lived and did she have any kids. He told her that she had a daughter. But then, as fast as he made the claim, Turner backtracked and said that he wasn't serious, In court, Turner's attorney argued that he'd only made that claim to try to impress Moore.
And he says that he saw that it wouldn't impress her. Then he said, no, I didn't really shoot anybody. And his testimony was that he really didn't shoot anybody. He was just bragging.
But Turner hadn't just boasted. Moore also said that Hondras and Turner came back to her apartment and asked her to hide a black handgun. She refused. Now, if Turner was only joking about shooting a woman, why did he need help hiding a gun? On top of that, other witnesses claimed they'd seen both of the alleged accomplices after the shooting, the pair of them.
Detectives talked to a couple of women who lived on the 6th floor of the same building who said that Hondras and Turner came to them with the TV and the rocking chair.
One of those women was Lynette Fitch, Tim Brown's girlfriend. Fitch said that Hondras wanted them to stash the stolen items at her place.
She refused. And she suggested that they try another woman who lived on the 1st floor of another Abbott high-rise. And they ultimately took the TV and rocking chair to this woman's apartment.
Hondras' attorney was a man named Alan Sincox. He admitted that his client did move the rocking chair to another apartment, but argued that Hondras was only offering Turner a helping hand. In other words, he was trying to say Hondras, the ex-con, might look like he was in charge, but actually, the high schooler was, according to Sincox. And in an effort to take suspicion off his client, Sincox argued the obvious, saying that any of the people who hung out in the vacant apartment, 1108, could have murdered Ruthie Mae McCoy, including, in his words, quote, some of those who will testify. What he's basically suggesting here is that Tim Brown, the state's star witness, could be pointing the finger at Hondras and Turner to hide the identity of the real killer or killers.
The police did not get a confession from anyone. And so the prosecution was stuck with the statement of Tim Brown.
The prosecution needed Tim Brown to take the stand and reiterate everything he said in his signed statement.
And he did not.
That's when the case against Turner and Hondras fell apart. It was Tim Brown's word against the accused. And Brown would no longer say they did it. In fact, he would make a damning allegation against the police.
Prosecutors often say, we don't choose our witnesses. We have to go with what we got.
That's Steve again, talking about Tim Brown.
He isn't the kind of guy we choose as a witness, but that doesn't mean he wasn't telling the truth.
Brown was 24 years old and a key witness for the prosecution. 3 years before he would testify in court, Brown had signed a 6-page statement. The state's attorney noted that it was taken in the dead of night at 4 a.m. on April 26, 1987, just 4 days after Ruthie Mae called 911. There were challenges to Brown's credibility as a witness.
Tim Brown had a couple of felony convictions, which were relatively minor, as I recall. I think they were possession of a controlled substance with intent to deliver. But that's the kind of thing that's defense lawyers can make a lot of, saying, well, he's a drug peddler, you can't trust him.
When prosecutors called him to the stand, they wanted him to share how Turner and Hondras were in Ruthie Mae's apartment when he heard 4 shots, and how the pair had allegedly come back to the crime scene to collect the shell casings.
The statement that police and the state's attorneys had from Tim Brown was what's called a handwritten statement. So at trial, Tim Brown said, I didn't really say that. The police abused me. They grabbed me between the legs.
Brown didn't only backtrack. He denied giving the police the statement at all and accused them of coercing him into signing it.
It's clear that the case had fallen apart for the state when Tim Brown did that.
He claimed police threatened him.
And they said they might charge me as an accomplice.
Former Detective Anthony Menina, one of the investigators Brown was accusing, blew off the idea that Brown was coerced. He said it was common for a witness to backtrack and accuse the police of misconduct.
That was a standard procedure. You've got jailhouse lawyers that are constantly trying to get people off of their cases.
The assistant state's attorney who took Brown's statement was Linda Wolishin. She testified at the time that no officers were in the room when she wrote down Brown's statement, and that Brown had said he was treated well by officers. When we talked to her 30 years later, she told us she didn't remember this case, but she did say that it was common practice for her to ask officers and detectives to leave the room when she took a witness's testimony. Brown's new story shifted the blame away from Turner, the teenager. He now said that Turner didn't even go through the bathroom mirror.
It was Hondras, but the other guy was a guy named Bo.
Remember, Bo was another one of the friends at the apartment next door to Ruthie Mae's. He was never arrested for this crime.
And Brown said that when he heard the gunshots, Turner was still in 1108 sitting on the couch in the living room.
Tim Brown and his friend, Corey Flournoy, first told police they weren't even in apartment 1108, the one next to Ruthie Mae's, the night of the murder.
One of them said that they stayed at somebody's house, and the other one said they stayed in a motel afterwards. And so detectives used the inconsistency when they re-interviewed Brown.
Eventually, Brown and Flournoy admitted that they were actually in that apartment.
And that's when they got the statement that, yeah, I was there, and yeah, Hondras and Turner did it, the ones who went into the apartment.
Former Detective Menina described having to repeatedly re-interview witnesses as part of the job. He said it was rare for someone to tell the truth the first time around.
We told him what he said the first time, and he'd make a different lie. So by the time he got through with 3 or 4, he didn't remember what he said, and you eventually wound up with the truth.
So Brown gave at least 3 different stories. His first story to detectives, his official statement, and now this new one that he was giving in court. But let's talk about that handwritten statement for a second. Steve pointed out that when you hear the phrase handwritten statement, the assumption might be that Brown handwrote the statement.
But actually, the person being questioned, in Chicago at least, is just writing his signature. It's a state's attorney who's with felony review, who is called to the station when detectives feel they have somebody solid ready to give a statement.
So Tim Brown only signed the statement. Once the prosecution finished their line of questioning, the defense got their turn.
There wasn't a lot that the defense lawyers really had to do because it was clear they had enough to impeach Brown. I mean, he was saying one thing at one point and another at another point.
While we were talking through the case on Zoom, Steve turned to one of his stacks of papers and grabbed a write-out of when John Hondras' attorney, Alan Sincox, cross-examined Tim Brown. Originally, Brown claimed a different friend named Bo was involved in removing the medicine cabinet.
Attorney Alan Sincox said, "Did you tell any of the police officers that Bo was one of the ones who did this?" And Tim Brown says, "Yes." Sincox says, "You told them that Bo was the person who came through that hole and may have committed this crime?" "Yes." "How many times did you tell them that?" Tim Brown says, "I don't know. It might have been just once. They asked so many questions day after day that I don't remember."
Brown took his denial a step further and claimed he didn't even know Ruthie Mae McCoy.
In his statement, he had said he had told Hondras that an old lady named Miss May lived in 1109. But on the stand, he said that besides his girlfriend, he didn't know the names of any of the women.
Steve read from his reporting how Brown contradicted even the most fundamental claims he made in his statement.
He said he had no idea you could break into apartments in the building via the medicine cabinets until the night McCoy was killed, which contradicted what he had in his statement. He said that the music they were listening to that night wasn't loud at all because, quote, "We got neighbors up there. We give our neighbors our respect." It's not fair to him to say that he flipped for sure because we don't know exactly what he told police and the state's attorney.
But none of Steve's reporting suggested the police actually abused Brown.
The detectives who were involved in this case, investigating this case, and the state's attorneys who took the statement did not have a reputation for coercing confessions. I think that's an important factor. In this case, even though it was a handwritten statement, it was a little more trustworthy than some other handwritten statements.
So you say these detectives and the state's attorney don't have a history of doing that kind of thing?
Right. To my knowledge, that's true. In the majority of murder cases, I don't think detectives are physically abusing suspects. I think there's a lot of trickery that goes on, and there's a lot of leaning on people. So, Tim Brown said they grabbed him between the legs and, could have happened, but I doubt it.
Again, the assistant state's attorney said no officers were in the room when she took the statement. And while coercion may not have happened in this case, the Chicago PD during this time did have a notorious reputation for abuse and even torture of Black men and women. The United Nations has repeatedly condemned the U.S. and Chicago for not doing more to fix the problem.
He said that they were threatening that he might be an accomplice. They might charge him as an accomplice. That's more believable to me, leaning on a suspect that way.
Now, we don't know why Tim Brown might have changed his story, but the damage was done.
The prosecution was stuck with the statement of Tim Brown. So when he backed off of that statement, the case was gone.
The defense had questioned Tim Brown and made their point. But at least Turner's attorneys thought hearing directly from the accused could help their case. So they called Turner himself to the stand.
He saw that the door to her apartment was open. And so he peeked in and he saw Ruthie Mae's body. I can understand that from a detective's point of view, that you would hone in on the two people who are mentioned regularly. But of course, that doesn't mean that they did it, just because their names kept coming up.
Steve watched as the defense called Edward Turner to the stand, where the young man would make his own case. During the trial, Steve hadn't only gotten to know Willie McCoy. He also met relatives of the two accused men, Hondras and Turner.
His mother, Aletha Turner, said that during one of the recesses when I talked with her, she said there have been so many lies. They take a truth and they wrap it up in a lie. Then they take a lie and they wrap it up in a truth. My son wouldn't be here if it weren't so many lies. They said they were taking him for questioning. They kept him 3 years for questioning.
He read straight from his reporting.
She said, I know he did not kill anyone. He wouldn't do something like that. I know he wouldn't because I whooped his ass when he was coming up. His last ass whooping I gave him, he was 18 years old.
Turner used to get into a lot of fights in school when he was younger. That's how he got his nickname, Montefiore. It was a reference to Montefiore, which used to be an alternative school in Chicago for kids who struggled with learning and discipline. Aletha Turner did not want to record an interview, but we talked to her for over an hour. She said her son knew her neighbor, Ruthie Mae. She said he wouldn't hurt her, and that she didn't let her son run the streets like other teens.
In the project, she was especially strict with Edward, she said, during those years. I didn't like him having any dealings with the young men in this area. He was in church mostly.
As she argued her son's innocence, Aletha said Turner didn't easily give in to peer pressure.
They would always threaten him to join a gang, but he never did let that bother him. Every time they asked him what he was riding, what gang he was with, he'd tell them he was riding Jesus Christ, and they didn't understand that.
Turner's mom said that when he turned 18, she loosened up a bit.
When police contacted her in April '87 and told her they wanted to question her son, she thought they might want him for peddling drugs.
His mom, Aletha, didn't think that he could be connected to a murder. In fact, the week this all was happening was normally a happier time for their family. Both Aletha and Edward Turner's birthdays were coming up.
It didn't come up at trial, but I think it was according to a witness that Turner said that he called his mom and said he was going to give her a color TV after he had taken the TV from either Miss May's apartment or the hallway outside of it.
When they did call Turner to the stand, he admitted that he was in Ruthie Mae's apartment that night she was killed. But he said that he did not pull the trigger.
Turner later testifies that, yes, he took the TV that he saw was sitting outside of apartment 1109 later that night.
Sitting next to the prosecution table was a 19-inch RCA TV and the rocking chair that belonged to Ruthie Mae. On the stand, Turner claimed that when he saw a light on in 1108 from outside, he went back up to the 11th floor. When he got there, he saw someone named Belder. You haven't heard him mentioned yet. Anyway, Turner now said he saw Belder leaving apartment 1108, the one next to Ruthie Mae's. Belder had the rocking chair and asked Turner to grab the TV. Turner testified that's when he noticed the door to Ruthie Mae's apartment was slightly open. He kicked open the door, took a few steps in, and could see Ruthie Mae's body in the bedroom.
He saw a woman's body laying in the apartment, and then he left with the TV and went downstairs.
This is inconsistent with what the cops saw when they showed up at Ruthie Mae's. There were no signs of forced entry, and the door was locked. But that was Turner's story. He admitted that he didn't call for help. Aletha acknowledged her son looked into the apartment, saw Ruthie Mae lying there, and did nothing.
And he hadn't reported it to the police. He had just taken the TV. So she said, where I live at in the projects, the rule is, and she put a finger to her lips.
Aletha then turned and pointed at Willie McCoy, sitting on a bench behind her.
He knows about them projects. At that point, McCoy nodded and said, yes, I know about them projects. They would have probably hurt him.
Steve told me that Aletha walked up the aisle of the courtroom to the bench where Willie McCoy was sitting and put her hand on his shoulder.
She said, my son should have done something about her, meaning Ruthie Mae, if he's seen her laying like that. But I understand why he just left with that TV. He did what he had to do. If I see somebody shoot you, I cannot run and tell police because, you see, I got to live there. If they can't see that, they should come live in the projects like we do. I feel satisfied now, she went on. I wanted to know, did my son have anything to do with the killing? And now I know he didn't.
To this day, Aletha Turner says her son was innocent, just as she felt back then. The question was, would a jury agree? Coming up in the final episode of Candyman, the true story behind the bathroom mirror murder. In the spring of 1990, a judge and jury considered whether John Hondras and Edward Turner were guilty of killing Ruthie Mae McCoy. Their attorneys argued they were innocent, but throughout the investigation, their names came up most frequently as suspects. And when the time came for the prosecution's key witness to take the stand, he changed his story at the last minute. Now, their fates were up in the air. We're talking a lot about Ruthie Mae now, but back then, her murder got very little attention. Not a lot of folks came to the trial. And it's thanks mostly to the doggedness of Steve Bagheera that we're talking about Ruthie Mae's case now. And we aren't the only ones turning our attention to Ruthie Mae. A new museum set to open later this year will highlight her story.
We tell the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Lisa Yun Lee is the executive director of the National Public Housing Museum. They renovated a 3-story public housing building in Chicago. The museum will showcase how apartments looked decades ago.
The objects and artifacts that we've found, that we've saved and salvaged, and that people have given to us.
One object they salvaged from back then was a medicine cabinet. Lee knows that there's no story related to those medicine cabinets that's more well-known than Ruthie Mae's.
For many people, one of the most famous stories in public housing.
They'll hang a cabinet on the wall, and then on each side of the cabinet, they'll put 2 different portrayals of life in public housing.
So on one side, this medicine cabinet tells the story of really incredible health programs and medical care that was always available in public housing complexes.
And then on the other,
there's the story of Ruthie McCoy, which is also true about this medicine cabinet.
To Lee, the tragedy of Ruthie Mae's death holds lessons for how the country approaches public housing today.
Housing precarity being what it is today, it's like one of the biggest issues facing all of us. This history is incredibly relevant.
And even as history reminds us of its failures, Ruthie Mae's story still shows us some of the valuable things that public housing can do for people. She had a consistent place to stay after her home flooded and was provided access to a psychiatric center where she received care. Despite so many challenges, Ruthie Mae used public housing to set a path toward a better life.
We're asking people to take a moment and to care to look a little more deeply.
The medicine cabinet exhibit is called Care to Look.
It's a capacious history. History is big, and never again will a single story be told as if it's the only one.
And for how big history is, Ruthie Mae's story manages to stay relevant for generations.
I think I wrote a lot of stories that really shed light on what poverty was like in Chicago in the 80s and 90s.
Here's reporter Steve Bagheera.
But people don't pay attention to most of those stories. But this one is kind of revived so that people do pay attention to it more than 3 decades later.
He credits Candyman for generating attention around Ruthie Mae's legacy, but plenty of real-life events get mentioned in movies. There's something deeper at play when we remember Ruthie Mae.
Ruthie Mae's experience was concentrated poverty. It's a combination of deep poverty and racial segregation.
What is her legacy? What has come of these public housing projects today? And were her killers ever brought to justice?
You never know what a jury is going to do.
I'm Dometi Pongo. From 48 Hours, this is Candyman, the true story behind the bathroom mirror murder. Episode 6, Ruthie Mae's Reflection. Ruthie Mae McCoy's legacy will forever be intertwined with the 1992 Candyman film.
I mean, mainstream stories and myths have a lot of power.
Lisa Yun Lee from the National Public Housing Museum believes the film and its sequels have kept Ruthie Mae's story alive, but each one has also done something different.
I think the original Candyman contributed to inscribing some terrible racialized stereotypes about these places. And on the flip side, I kind of feel like the remake of Candyman actually did something very different.
In 2021, fans of the franchise got to see Candyman in a new light. It was the first time a Candyman film was written and directed by people of color. Director Nia DaCosta used the remake to challenge stereotypes around public housing and historically Black neighborhoods.
It'll take a minute and then people will be studying over and talking about her film for years to come.
Remember Robin Means Coleman? She's a media professor at the University of Virginia. She told me that this more recent film is part of a movement to use horror to examine deeper issues within American society, especially about race.
So inevitably, that real life horror is going to inform entertainment horror. And the social issues appear in lots of horror films, but they're particularly acute in Black horror films.
The fourth Candyman is set in 2019, decades after the original. Helen, the graduate student who investigated Candyman for her research paper and died in a bonfire, is referenced but is not the film's focus. Instead of a white protagonist, the central character is Black. He's an artist named Anthony McCoy.
The kind of connective tissue is like trauma. It's violence. The Candyman is sort of violent. Cabrini is violent. The government is violent. There's structural violence that sends people to where they are in these films.
A reference to the details of Ruthie Mae's murder is in the fourth film, too. The main character, Anthony, starts researching Candyman and gets a tape recorder from the library. As he becomes more obsessed with Candyman, There's a scene where Anthony is vigorously painting and listening to a recording of two women from the original film as they retell the murder of a woman named Ruthie.
So Ruthie called 911 and she said there's somebody coming through the walls. And they didn't believe her. They thought the lady was crazy, right? So she called 911 again and they still didn't believe her. But when they finally got there, she was dead.
By 2019, Cabrini Green and the Abbott homes where Ruthie Mae lived were long gone. In the movie, and in real life, the high-rise projects had been demolished. Many low-income residents of the neighborhood were forced to leave. Their homes were replaced by new development and housing designed to attract wealthier residents. I should warn you, if you haven't seen the movie yet, there are going to be some spoilers as we get into the differences between the fourth and the first Candyman.
I think that the chief difference is now, certainly there's the absence of Helen and a focus on Black communities, Black families, Black relationships, extended families. That's the other thing. In the 92 movie, you're like, where are these people's kin?
It's revealed that Anthony, the painter, was the baby that Helen, the blonde grad student from the first Candyman, saved from the fire in the original film. At the end of the 2021 film, Anthony becomes Candyman. And this movie makes some big changes to the lore surrounding the Candyman character's history. The police gun down the character, Anthony McCoy, at the end of the most recent movie. Keep in mind, this film was released only a little more than a year after George Floyd's death, and his murder was weighing heavy on America at the time. But in the movie, Anthony gets his revenge. Once he's Candyman, he kills the officers who murdered him.
Even though Anthony is turning into something, he's an unwilling martyr to the kind of Black pain and trauma that we see.
Coleman read me something the director, Nia DaCosta, once said.
So Nia says, I love this quote. Can I read this quote?
Absolutely.
She says, Candyman at the intersection of white violence and Black pain is about unwilling martyrs.
The character, Anthony McCoy, is an unwilling martyr in the 2021 film. The police kill him. The original Candyman character, Daniel Robitaille, was an unwilling martyr. He was tortured and lynched by an angry mob. And in a way, Ruthie Mae was an unwilling martyr too. She's remembered for how she died, remembered for how she was let down.
When we talk about speaking names and saying names and reminding about justice denied, we do want to say Ruthie Mae McCoy's name and keep saying her name, because it isn't just about her murder. That's a core to how we know her. But Ruthie Mae McCoy symbolizes all of the sort of failures.
One of the reasons Ruthie Mae's story still resonates today is we're still reckoning with these failures. A lot of us can relate to not feeling safe in our own homes, worrying that when a call for help is made, no one will come. In the 2021 movie, a Black woman summons Candyman for protection, which is much different from the original. And that subtle change makes saying the name Candyman an act of empowerment rather than victimization. Coleman thinks that idea echoes the real-life movement to keep the names of victims of injustice alive.
So in saying Candyman's name in 1992 doesn't get us justice. In this Candyman, you say his name because we're asking for justice.
For Coleman, Ruthie Mae is on a long list of names that she intends to say out loud.
Ruthie Mae McCoy is a real-life person. Her family are alive and out there.
Back in 1990, Ruthie Mae's family was still waiting for justice. They were about to learn whether the two men accused of killing Ruthie Mae would be found guilty. Her older brother, Willie McCoy, had watched the whole trial unfold. Finally, after 3 years, he was about to find out what would happen to the 2 young men accused of her murder.
He wanted to make sure that the right people got convicted.
Steve Bagheera was there as the prosecution and the defense made their closing arguments.
I always feel it's pretty poignant to see these cases where there's an awful lot on the line and there's so little interest. But that is quite common in Chicago.
The family of the defendants and Ruthie Mae's brother, Willie McCoy, were there to watch. John Hondras had chosen a bench trial where Judge Michael Getty decided his fate, while Edward Turner had chosen a jury.
Both trials were taking place simultaneously.
Turner's attorney focused his closing arguments on the circumstances of Turner's life and the choices available to him, like the choice not to call the police. He argued that if Turner had called 911, police might have thought he was a suspect, or his neighbors could consider him a snitch, putting his life in danger. Steve said the jury left the room and came back with a verdict in less than 4 hours. Turner was sweating as he looked down at the table.
Edward Turner told me that he was scared when the jury came back. He said, I would have went off if they told me I was guilty. I wouldn't have known how to take that garbage, life in prison for something I didn't do.
The clerk read the verdict on the charge of first-degree murder. Not guilty. Steve remembered someone in the court cheered, to which the judge threatened jail time. The clerk continued, reading off 3 more verdicts. Not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. The jury decided Turner had not committed armed robbery or invaded Ruthie Mae's home beyond a reasonable doubt. And even though Turner had admitted on the stand that he had taken Ruthie Mae's TV, the jury also found him not guilty of burglary. He was free to go. Back in April 1990, Steve watched Turner sit back in his chair and smile. His ordeal was over. Steve said Turner told him back then
he didn't know who killed McCoy, and he didn't regret any of his actions on the night she was killed, not even his failure to call police after he saw McCoy's body. If he had it to do over, he said to me, I would have seen it and didn't seen it, just like I did. I wasn't going to jeopardize my family's life.
Willie had spoken to family members of the accused. Edward Turner's mother, Aletha, repeated something to Willie that she'd said to Steve.
The fact that Edward Turner wouldn't call police when he saw Ruthie Mae lying in the apartment, his mother, I think, said he should have called police. But if he did, he would have been suspect number 1. So she could understand how in the milieu of the projects, that would be an understandable response. And Willie was okay with that explanation. He said that he felt the defendants aren't the only ones that should be on trial. He said that the people who designed these projects should be on trial.
Willie showed his understanding once again when he walked past Turner's family on his way out of the courthouse.
In the hallway outside the courtroom, Turner's mother is screaming, my child's coming home, and crying. And Willie McCoy walked past the relatives, and he looked relieved, not disappointed. And he told me maybe he was innocent. But even if he wasn't, you can't convict an individual on such little evidence.
Willie left and didn't return to hear the verdict in John Hondras' case.
He wanted justice for Ruthie Mae, but he also wanted the right people convicted if anyone was going to be convicted.
Steve wrote that in the closing arguments of Hondras' case, the prosecutor admitted Tim Brown had been a flawed witness, but argued the detectives had conducted an honorable investigation. He said, quote, they didn't choose their witnesses, and neither did we. But the detectives wouldn't be the focus of Judge Michael Getty's frustration. He was upset with the responding officers the night Ruthie Mae died.
Well, this was a veteran judge. He knew how police were supposed to work. So to him, it was unconscionable that the officers didn't go into the apartment that night that they got that call, not just from Ruthie Mae, but from two neighbors reporting gunshots, that they could somehow leave without going in and seeing what was up in that apartment.
Judge Getty said, quote, "This case was lost, not by the state's attorneys. This case was not even lost by the detectives, who got the only evidence that they got in a damaged and sanitized crime scene. This case was lost by the patrol division of the Chicago Police Department, who stood by with a deaf ear to the multiple reports of gunshots being fired in 1109. They just couldn't be bothered with the hassle of entering a locked door, so they let them get away with it." End quote. He went on to say about John Hondras, "This defendant may or may not be guilty, but the state has clearly failed to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This court must accordingly find the defendant not guilty. He's discharged." And with that, no one would be held accountable for Ruthie Mae's murder. Hondras never spoke to Steve for a story back in the day, and never responded to our attempts to reach out to him either. But Steve did speak with Hondras's half-brother, who had attended the trial.
His half-brother, Darnell Dean, told me in the hallway, "I feel good about him getting out, but there's no reason to celebrate." He wanted the truth to come out as to who really did it. But everyone over there, meaning in the projects, knows who killed that lady. Just ain't nobody at liberty to say. But it wasn't John.
Willie McCoy hadn't come back to hear the Hondras ruling.
Prosecutors had already told him that Hondras was going to walk as well.
Steve decided to call Willie and tell him the prosecutor's prediction was correct. His sister's killer, or killers, whoever they were, got away.
The first thing McCoy did was lean on his religious faith.
I thought it was a travesty.
Former Chicago detective Anthony Menina thought it was a travesty that the two men he arrested for Ruthie Mae's murder were acquitted.
Judge Getty, he gave a fair statement of what he believed. And his statement was that it wasn't on the detectives. And, he claimed it was on the patrol division. But in actuality, I also add that to the CHA police.
In a phone call, he reiterated that he believes the CHA police, not the patrol officers, are the ones at fault for not letting patrol officers into Ruthie Mae's apartment sooner.
How could you show up in an apartment with a wrong key and then say, "I'll be back tomorrow"?
From his perspective, the patrol officers' hands were tied. Even though police regularly break into private property, he simply doesn't think the patrol officers had enough cause in this situation. They were on CHA property, and the CHA did not want to break down the door.
It's a CHA property. The CHA would have to give the okay.
He said this might have been handled differently if the police had permission to break in from a relative, but that wasn't the situation. Plus, to Menina at least, they ultimately arrested the right men. He doesn't consider this a cold case.
A cold case is a case that occurred where the offender was not caught, and the case is still pending, but cold. In this circumstance, we believed we had the right guy. So therefore, it's already in the courts. So with that fact, it's not a cold case as far as I'm concerned.
Again, this is former Detective Menina's opinion. Hondras and Turner were found not guilty of killing Ruthie Mae. Still, for Menina,
as far as we were concerned, we cleared this case.
Clearing a case means that the officers met the criteria to consider the case solved. Once cops say a case has been cleared, that means from their perspective, they don't have to reopen it. As for Willie McCoy, Ruthie Mae's brother, he dealt with the fact that the criminal justice system failed to catch his sister's killer.
His reaction wasn't, "That's so unfair." There was, as often happens in these cases, some meeting of the minds between family and friends of the defendants, and in this case, the relative, Willie.
Steve said that Willie relied on his religious faith.
He said, "God will take care of them eventually." I believe that. The killers are free, but they're not free in spirit. They know what they did, and it's always going to be in their mind. They can boast. They can say, oh man, we beat it. But that's just going to open a trap door for them. They'll think they can get away with something again, but sooner or later the axe will fall.
As their conversation went on, Willie did let some of his anger seep out. Here's Steve again, reading straight from his notes.
If that would have been a white woman that called police like my sister did, you know they would have gone in her apartment. You know it. This whole system we're living in is corrupt, he said. He tries not to dwell on the injustices in it. If you do, you will explode. You will explode, he said.
Steve didn't stay in touch with Willie, and we tried different contact information for him, but never heard back from anyone. If he's alive, he'd be in his 90s. According to Edward Turner's mother, Aletha, her son went on to have a good life. He died in his 50s from cancer. But John Hondras was arrested again, about a year after his acquittal in Ruthie Mae's case. In 1993, he was convicted of second-degree murder for a different killing. Steve Bagheera was the one who posed the question. What killed Ruthie Mae? A bullet in the chest or life in the projects? The answer was both.
I do think that things are much better because Abbott Homes no longer exists, nor does the high rises at Cabrini and Robert Taylor and Stadeway. Everything was knocked down around the year 2000.
Now, at Ruthie Mae's old address was a resource center for unemployed adults. It's next to an empty field. Steve has written a book and retired from the Chicago Reader. For his book, Courtroom 302, Steve spent 1 year in a Cook County courtroom. He said that way back when he wrote his stories about Ruthie Mae, his intention was never to write an indictment of all public housing.
The concentration of deep poverty, in my mind, was the more important factor. People can get along just fine in high rises and with back-to-back medicine cabinets. But because concentrated poverty leads inevitably to more violence, filling those high rises with the deeply poor is a recipe for disaster. A disaster that the buildings themselves then exacerbate. And then the violence worsens physical and mental health, and the residents are caught in a downward spiral.
Deborah Lastly, Ruthie Mae's neighbor, blames those circumstances for her friend's death. And when asked the question, what killed Ruthie Mae McCoy, she blamed the projects and the people who used to run them.
So to me, the people that worked for the project, and because the project didn't get themselves together, they didn't care because they wasn't living there.
The way whoever killed Ruthie Mae entered her apartment can make any of us question whether something could be lurking behind our own reflection. Ruthie Mae's reflection is her legacy, and that we say her name all these years later. We retell again and again how she died. And it's not that different from how the 2021 Candyman explains the ghost's relevance in the 21st century.
But a story like that, a pain like that, lasts forever. That's Candyman.
In the same way, the latest film helped to change the narrative. Maybe this telling of a story does too. The scariest part is that the film is fictional, but not the horror. From 48 Hours, this is Candyman, the true story behind the bathroom mirror murder. I'm your host and co-executive producer, Dometi Pongo. Judy Tygard is the executive producer of 48 Hours. Jamie Benson is the senior producer for Paramount Audio, and Maura Walls is the senior story editor. Development by 48 Hours field producer Morgan Canty. Recording assistance from Marlon Polycarp and Alan Payne. Special thanks to Paramount Podcast Vice President Megan Marcus. Candyman, the true story behind the bathroom mirror murder, is produced by Sony Music Entertainment. It was reported, written, and produced by Alex Schumann. Our executive producers are Catherine St. Louis and Jonathan Hirsch. Our associate producer is Summer Tamad. Theme and original music composed by Cedric Wilson. He sound designed and mixed the episodes. We also use music from APM. Fendel Fulton is our fact checker. And our production manager is Tamika Balance-Kalasny. If you enjoyed this series, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.